the 12 things Enki said about Earth, and the final one is why they can never leave us alone. There is a record buried inside the oldest writing on the planet that no mainstream institution wants to explain. Not because it is unclear, not because the tablets are damaged or the language is disputed. The record is there, translated, sitting in university archives, quoted in academic journals, and almost never discussed in any context that would reach a general audience. It is a record of things said, not things done, not things built, not floods or creations or genetic experiments, though all of those appear in the surrounding text. This is specifically a record of statements, declarations, things spoken aloud in divine assembly, inscribed because the speakers intended them to last, and then buried in the collapse of the first cities while the people who wrote them scattered into the desert. 12 statements, made by one figure, about this planet. His name in the Sumerian records is Enki. In Akkadian texts, he is Ea. In later Babylonian tradition, he becomes the architect of every major turning point in human history. He is the one who creates the first human beings out of clay and divine blood. He is the one who warns a man named Ziusudra, or Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, depending on the version you are reading, that a flood is coming and tells him exactly how to survive it. He is the one who places the Apkallu, the seven sages, as teachers inside early human settlements, specifically to preserve civilizational knowledge across catastrophic resets. He is, by any honest reading of the source material, the most consequential figure in the Sumerian religious and cosmological tradition. And yet 11 of the 12 things he said about this planet are treated as poetic metaphor, ritual language, or symbolic expression. The 12th is simply not discussed. We are going to go through all 12 today. We are going to look at what was actually written, what the mainstream translation gives you, what the ancient astronaut reading gives you, and where those two readings diverge in ways that matter for understanding who we are, why we are here, and what the statement that no one wants to talk about actually implies about the ongoing relationship between whatever Enki was and whatever this planet is. This will take time. If you are here for a quick answer, you will not find one. The material is dense, the stakes are high, and the final statement requires everything that comes before it to land with the weight it actually carries. Stay with it. Because by the end, the question is not whether you believe the ancient astronaut interpretation. The question is whether you can explain the 12th statement any other way without the explanation becoming more absurd than the interpretation itself. We begin at the beginning. Quick pause. For the first time since the 12 codes, there is a second document. It is called the 7 resets. Every time the world was erased, matched against the Sumerian record of these interventions, and the checklist of signs for the 8th reset, 4 are already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. That is all. Back to the video. The source material for what follows is not fringe literature. It is not channeled text or modern speculation. It is the published corpus of Sumerian cuneiform tablets, most of them excavated from the city mounds of southern Mesopotamia in the 19th and 20th centuries, housed primarily in the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, the Istanbul Archaeology Museums, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. The translations come from scholars including Samuel Noah Kramer, Thorkild Jacobson, Benno Landsberger, Jeremy Black, and Graham Cunningham. These are not obscure figures. Kramer's work on Sumerian literature is the foundational academic text in the field. Jacobson's Treasures of Darkness remains the most comprehensive analysis of Mesopotamian religious worldview in English. The disagreement is not about whether the tablets say what they say. The disagreement is about what we are permitted to conclude from what they say. Ancient astronaut researchers argue that the permitted conclusions are far narrower than the actual evidence warrants. They argue that scholars apply a consistent interpretive filter, one that classifies anything resembling an advanced technological or cosmological framework as myth, symbolism, or poetic elaboration before the evidence is even examined on its own terms. They argue that when you remove that filter, what you find is not poetry. What you find is a report about people who came here, what they found when they arrived, what they decided to do with it, what they disagreed about among themselves, and most importantly, what they said, on the record, in assembly, about this planet and their relationship to it. 12 of those statements are attributable specifically to Enki. To understand why those 12 statements matter and why the 12th one matters in a way that reframes the other 11, you need to understand who Enki was inside the Sumerian cosmological structure. Enki is one of the 4 primary deities in the Sumerian pantheon. The 4 are Anu, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag. Anu is the Sky Father, the highest authority, the one whose name means heaven itself. Enlil is the heir between heaven and earth, the executive authority, the one who actually runs planetary operations. Enki is the waters, specifically the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed existed beneath the surface of the earth. And he is also the lord of wisdom, of craft, of language, of magic, and of the fundamental mechanisms by which civilization functions. The Sumerian word for the things Enki holds is mi. The mi are usually translated as divine laws or the components of civilization, but that translation is so inadequate it borders on misleading. A more accurate description is that the mi are operational parameters. They are the instructions, or the programs, if you want to use a modern framework, that define what things are and how they function. The mi include kingship and priesthood, descent into the underworld and return from it, the scribal arts, music, the craft of the smith, the craft of the builder, truth, the art of war, the art of lovemaking, the destruction of cities, the preservation of cities. There are over 100 mi in the complete lists. Enki holds all of them. He is their custodian. He is the one who decides which ones go where, who gets access to them, and when they are deployed. This is not a metaphor. In the ancient astronaut reading, the mi are a literal library of civilizational technology, programs, protocols, instructions for running a society, and Enki is the one who controls access to that library. He is also the one who designed the human being. The Sumerian creation accounts, particularly the Atrahasis epic and the text known as Enki and Ninmah, describe a labor crisis among the Anunnaki. The lower-ranking gods, called the Agigi, have been performing physical labor on Earth, digging canals, mining ore, maintaining agricultural systems, for an enormous amount of time. The tablets say 40 times 40 years, which in this context likely means something more like an extended generational period rather than a precise calculation. They have had enough. There is a rebellion. The rebellion reaches the point where Enlil himself is besieged in his own house. Enki's solution is to create a substitute laborer. He takes genetic material described as the blood of a slain god, mixes it with clay, and through a process of biological engineering in which Ninhursag acts as the birth mother, produces the first human beings. The Sumerian word for this substitute is Lulu, meaning mixed one, or primitive worker. What the ancient astronaut researchers focus on is not just that the creation happened, but the specific language used to describe the genetic mixing. The tablets describe a te'ema, a term translated as essence, spirit, or image, being taken from the divine body and combined with earth material. They describe a procedure, a container, a purification process, and a gestation period. The description is not the description of a supernatural act. It is the description of a laboratory procedure. And it is Enki who designs it, who supervises it, and who, when the first human beings come out wrong, iterates until they come out right. This is who is speaking the 12 statements. Statement 1 is found in the text known as Enki and the World Order. It is one of the longest and most architecturally elaborate of the Sumerian literary texts, running to over 400 lines in the Jacobson translation. In it, Enki undertakes a systematic journey around the earth and assigns divine responsibility for each aspect of the natural and civilizational world. He fills the rivers with fish. He fills the marshes with reeds and birds. He makes the fields produce grain. He assigns a god to the plow, a god to the yoke, a god to the storehouse. Before he does any of this, he speaks. The statement, translated from the cuneiform, reads in approximate form as follows. Enki says that when he approached the earth, great and verdant, it trembled at his feet like a running aurochs. He says that when he called to it, it thundered in response. He says that the earth, in its entirety, recognized him and bent to him, and that he caused her grain to come up from the ground like a fragrant perfume. The mainstream reading of this passage treats it as standard divine praise poetry. Enki is boasting about his power over nature. He is asserting his authority over agricultural productivity. This is entirely consistent with the genre of Sumerian royal and divine hymns, which are full of exactly this kind of hyperbolic self-assertion. The ancient astronaut reading asks a different question. Why does the earth tremble when he approaches? Why does it thunder in response when he calls? And most specifically, what does it mean that the earth recognized him? In the ancient astronaut framework, Enki is not describing a metaphorical relationship with a symbolic earth goddess. He is describing an arrival. He is describing a first contact between himself and this planet. And the specific language he uses, that the earth recognized him, suggests that the recognition was mutual. That whatever the Earth is in this passage, and in the ancient astronaut reading it, is a world with its own qualities and perhaps its own intelligence, or at least its own resonant frequency, it responded to his presence as something known. They had been here before, or the Earth had been surveyed before, or the frequency or signature of Enki's presence matched something in the planet's own record. This is the first statement. Earth responded to him, Earth recognized him, and the response was not fear or resistance. The response was a bending toward. Statement 2 comes from the same text but a different section. Having completed his survey of the Earth's natural systems, Enki turns to the territories of the world's great regions, and he says something that has never been adequately explained by the conventional reading. He says that he has directed his gaze toward the land of Meluha, which scholars identify as the Indus Valley civilization, and that it is a land of black trees, a land whose mountains yield precious stones, carnelian and lapis lazuli, gold from its rivers, and tin from its earth. He then says that the land of Meluha is the land where the sun rises, and that he has made it his seat. In context, Enki is claiming Meluha as his territory, his domain, the place that belongs to him, specifically among all the Earth's regions. The mainstream reading treats this as a mythological assertion of Sumerian political or cultural primacy, projected backward onto a divine figure. The Sumerians traded heavily with the Indus Valley. Enki's claim over Meluha may reflect the economic importance of that trade to the Mesopotamian economy. The ancient astronaut reading notes something the conventional explanation does not address. The description of Meluha in this passage is extraordinarily specific. The mineral wealth is catalogued, the geographic orientation, the sun rises there, is accurate. And the claim that Enki has made it his seat is not a casual metaphor. In the Sumerian administrative vocabulary, seat refers to an actual physical location of governance. A seat is where you operate from. A seat is where your instruments are. A seat is the place to which you return. If Enki is not a metaphor but a person, or a being of some kind with physical presence and operational requirements, then this statement says something concrete. He has a base of operations in the Indus Valley. He has chosen a specific geographic location on the Earth's surface, from which to conduct whatever it is he is conducting. This is statement 2. Among all the Earth's territory, he has chosen a seat. He has established a physical location. The work he is doing here requires a fixed point of operation. Statement 3 is found in the text known as Enki and Ninhursag, the paradise myth set in Dilmun, a place scholars generally associate with the island of Bahrain or the broader Persian Gulf region. The text describes Dilmun as a place where there is no sickness, no death, no predation, no old age, a paradise, and then it describes what Enki does there. He irrigates it. He fills it with sweet water. He causes date palms to grow. He makes it productive. Before all of this, he makes a statement about what Dilmun is. He says that Dilmun is a place that is clean, bright, and shining. He says it is a place where the sun rises and where the sun's light is specific and distinct from light elsewhere. He then says, and this is the third statement, that he will cause this place to become a dwelling place for the gods, a place of purity, a place where those from above can come down. The mainstream reading treats this as a description of a mythological sacred space. Dilmun is a paradise garden, a primordial perfect world before corruption enters. The gods dwelling there is entirely consistent with ancient Near Eastern cosmology, in which the divine beings inhabit idealized versions of earthly spaces. The ancient astronaut reading strips away the mythological frame and asks what a literal reading produces. A place where those from above can come down, a place being prepared specifically as a reception point, a place that is clean, bright, and shining in ways that distinguish it from other locations, being irrigated, cultivated, and made productive, not for human benefit, but as a dwelling place for divine visitors. In the ancient astronaut framework, Statement 3 is the description of a landing facility, or a reception base, or a site of regular arrival. The preparation of the site is logistical, not spiritual. The purity requirements are operational, not theological. And the gods who come down to it are physical beings who need a functional space. This is who Enki is and what he is doing in the third statement. He is preparing a physical location on Earth for regular visitation from beings who come from above. Statement 4 is the one that requires the most unpacking because it sits inside a text that mainstream scholarship has worked hardest to contain within a purely mythological frame. The text is the Atrahasis epic. The context is the creation of human beings, and the statement is made not at the moment of creation, but before it, during the divine council that decides the creation is necessary. Enki has been asked to solve the labor problem. He convenes what the tablets describe as a great assembly. The gods debate, and then Enki speaks. He says, in the texts as we have them, that the work must not be too heavy for the gods. He says that the task of maintaining the earth is greater than what the divine workforce can sustain. He says the solution already exists in the material of the earth itself. He says that the Te-Ma, the divine essence or image, can be mixed with the earth material, the clay, and something new can be produced that carries the capacity for both. Then he says something that the standard translations usually gloss over or fold into the surrounding narrative without stopping to examine it directly. He says that when this new being is made, it will bear the burden. But it will also, by the nature of what it is, carry something that cannot be removed. He says that the image that is placed in it will remain. He says that what is given cannot be taken back. Statement 4. In the ancient astronaut reading is not a creation instruction. It is a warning about irreversibility. Enki is not just describing how to make a human being. He is saying that the act of making one creates a permanent condition. The divine essence that goes into the creation does not disappear. It does not dilute into meaninglessness over generations. It persists, it accumulates, and the being that carries it will, over time, become something that was not originally planned for. The mainstream reading treats this as theological background for human dignity. Humans carry the divine image. This is the Sumerian parallel to the later Genesis language of being made in the image of God. The statement is a foundation myth for human spiritual significance. But the ancient astronaut reading says the warning is operational, not theological. Enki is telling the assembly something about the engineering. He is saying that the design has a permanent consequence. The Te-Ma, once incorporated, cannot be extracted. Whatever the human beings become over time, they will carry it, and that will change what they are in ways that are not fully predictable. This is not a blessing. This is a risk assessment. Statement 5 comes from a text fragment that sits at the intersection of the Atrahasis tradition and the Sumerian flood accounts, and it concerns something Enki says specifically about the relationship between human beings and the gods of the upper realm, the Anunnaki who remain in the sky rather than operating on Earth's surface. The statement is fragmentary. The tablets are damaged at the key passage. But what survives, pieced together from multiple fragments and cross-referenced with the Akkadian versions by scholars, including W.G. Lambert, says something that has not been resolved by conventional interpretation. Enki says that the beings below, meaning the human beings, will look up. He says they will look up and they will see what they were made from. He says this seeing cannot be prevented, because the image that was placed in them is the image that looks up. Statement 5 is the recognition problem. Enki is saying that the human beings will eventually understand their own origin, not because anyone will tell them, not because the records will survive intact, but because something in the structure of what they are will orient them toward the source of what was placed in them. In the ancient astronaut reading, this is a description of ancestral memory embedded in the genetic or cognitive structure of the created beings. The looking up is not metaphorical piety. It is a directional pull built into the hardware. The beings look toward the sky because the sky is where the template came from. Enki says this is not something that can be prevented. It is a consequence of the design. Whatever was used to make them ensures that they will always look toward the origin. This is why the mythology exists. This is why every culture on Earth, regardless of geographic isolation, looks up and tells stories about beings who came from the sky. In the ancient astronaut framework, it is not cultural coincidence. It is the design functioning exactly as Enki said it would in Statement 5. Statement 6 is found in the text known as Enki and Ninmah, the account of the creation process itself, and it is brief, but its implications are enormous. After the first round of creation, during which Ninhursag successfully produces 6 human beings as a kind of initial trial, Enki makes 6 more. His are impaired. They have physical limitations. They cannot perform the work they were made for. The text describes beings who cannot grip, beings who cannot see, beings who cannot control their own bodies properly. Ninhursag challenges Enki. She says, "What is the fate you will decree for these?" And Enki, for each one, assigns a role. The one who cannot grip becomes an official. The one who cannot see becomes a musician, because music requires the inner ear, not the outer eye. The one who cannot control his body becomes someone who washes the king's feet. Each being who comes out wrong is assigned to a function that works around the limitation rather than against it. Then Ninhursag presents her own challenge. She produces a being she calls Umul, translated as "my day is remote," a being so severely impaired that it cannot eat, cannot stand, cannot speak, cannot lie down with comfort. She asks Enki what fate he will decree for this one. He cannot answer. The text says he is silent. Statement 6 is the silence, and the statement that the silence implies. Because immediately before the silence, when Enki was assigning fates to the impaired beings, he said something that the ancient astronaut researchers mark as crucial. He said that the work of his hands must be sustained. He said that whatever comes from the making process carries the maker's responsibility. He said that to create is to be bound to what you have created. And then he is silent in the face of a creation he cannot sustain. A creation that cannot eat, cannot stand, cannot speak. The mainstream reading treats this as a mythological lesson about divine hubris and the limits of creative power. Even Enki cannot make everything work. Even the god of wisdom has failures. The ancient astronaut reading says the lesson is operational, and that the silence is the most important part of it. Enki said that to create is to be bound to what you have created. He said this, and it was recorded, and it became part of the foundational document of the creation tradition. And then the silence happened. And the silence demonstrated that the binding does not release, even when the creation fails. The maker is still responsible, still bound, still unable to simply walk away. If the human being is Enki's creation, and the ancient astronaut reading maintains that it is, then statement 6 and the silence it ends on carries a specific implication about the present. The binding has not been released. The responsibility has not been dissolved. Whatever impairments have accumulated in the human experiment over the course of its development, the maker is still bound to what was made. We will come back to this in the 12th statement, because the 12th statement is where that binding reaches its most explicit articulation. Statement 7 requires the most historical context of any of the 12, because it is not found in a single text, but reconstructed across 3 separate cuneiform traditions that describe the same moment from different angles. The moment is the divine assembly debate about the flood. Every version of the flood narrative in the Mesopotamian tradition, the Atrahasis, the Sumerian flood story, and the later Gilgamesh version, contains a council of gods, at which the decision to send the flood is made. In the Atrahasis version, the most complete, the decision comes after a series of smaller attempts to reduce the human population. Plague first, then famine, then a more comprehensive shutdown of agricultural productivity in which Enki himself is forced to participate under protest. Each time, Enki finds a workaround. He whispers to a dream, he sends a fish, he nudges a surviving human toward a solution. He does not defy the assembly openly. He routes around it. When the flood decision is finally made, Enki does not vote against it. The tablets are clear on this. He takes the oath of silence along with all the other gods. He swears not to warn the humans, and then he warns the humans. But before he does, before the loophole he famously exploits by speaking to a reed wall rather than directly to a person, he makes a statement in the assembly. Statement 7 is reconstructed from the Atrahasis fragments that precede the flood decree. Enki stands in the assembly and says the following. In approximate translation, he says that the work that has been done here cannot be undone by what is about to be done. He says that the image that was placed cannot be washed away by water. He says that what the earth has received into itself has become part of it. The mainstream reading treats this as a divine lament. Enki is mourning the coming destruction. He is expressing grief at the loss of the humans he made. The statement is an emotional beat in a narrative that leads to the flood. The ancient astronaut reading treats it as a technical objection. Enki is not mourning, he is arguing. He is saying that the flood cannot accomplish what Enlil thinks it will accomplish. He is saying that whatever the human beings are, whatever they have become in the Earth's ecology and in the Earth's own material substance, they have become part of it in ways that cannot be reversed by a surface-level erasure. The image that was placed cannot be washed away by water. This is not poetry about the human soul. In the ancient astronaut reading, this is Enki describing a physical reality, the biological material, the genetic inheritance, the Ti-ma. Water will kill the individuals. It will not remove what was placed. Whatever the experiment did to the earth, it has done it permanently. Enlil proceeds with the flood anyway, and Enki warns Atrahasis anyway. And after the flood, when the gods return and find Atrahasis alive and making offerings, Enlil is furious, and Enki admits what he did, but the way he admits it is the most carefully constructed legal evasion in the entire Sumerian tradition. He says he did not reveal the secret to the man. He spoke to a wall of reeds. He said the words to the wall. If the wall chose to let the words pass through, that is not a violation of the oath. The assembly accepts this, not because they believe it, but because the structure of the oath, the exact wording of the covenant, does not technically cover this case, and Enki knew that before he swore it. Statement 7, in full, is this. The earth has received the experiment has become part of the earth. The flood will not remove what was placed, and the oath can be honored and violated at the same time if the language of the oath is chosen carefully enough. Enki understood all of this before the assembly began. He made the statement knowing the assembly would proceed anyway. He made it because the record had to show that he said it. That when the decision was made, there was a dissenting voice on record. A voice that said this will not do what you think it will do. He was right. The flood happened. The humans survived it. And what was placed in them survived with them. Statement 8 is the shortest of the 12 statements and the most structurally strange. It appears in a fragment of the text known as the Eridu Genesis, which is the oldest of the Sumerian flood accounts, older than the Atrahasis by possibly several centuries. The fragment is damaged enough that scholars disagree about its precise content, but the surrounding text and the comparative analysis with the Atrahasis tradition allow a reasonable reconstruction. In the Eridu Genesis version, after the floodwaters recede, Enki speaks to the survivor, who in this version is called Ziusudra, king and priest. He instructs him on what to do now, how to rebuild, what comes next. And then, at the end of the instruction, he adds something that does not appear in the Atrahasis version, something that the later Gilgamesh tradition also drops. He says that the knowledge of what happened here must be preserved. He says the survivor must make a record. He says that the record must be placed in a location where water cannot reach it, where fire cannot reach it, and where time cannot dissolve it. Then he says the thing that is statement 8. He says the record must survive because we will need it. Not because humans will need it. Not because future generations of the survivors will want to know their history. We will need it. The mainstream reading either does not address the pronoun directly or treats it as a narrative voice slippage, an imprecision in the composition. Enki is the god of wisdom and knowledge. Of course, he values the preservation of knowledge. Of course, he would want records kept. The ancient astronaut reading stops at the pronoun and will not move past it. We will need it. Not you, we. If Enki is speaking from inside the human community, as a mythological representative of human memory and wisdom, the pronoun makes no sense. The survivors already know what happened. They lived through it. The record is not for them. If the record is for future humans who need to know their history, the pronoun should be they. We will need it means that the beings who are present at this moment, including Enki himself, will at some future point require access to what is written down now. And those beings are not human. Or not only human. They are a group that includes Enki, a group for which Enki is a member and is speaking in the first person plural. Statement 8 says that the record of what happened on Earth must be preserved for a future retrieval by those who were here when it happened, including whoever Enki is. The record has to survive because the people who created it will want to read it again. Statement 9 is found in the hymn tradition associated with Enki specifically. Texts that are not narrative but liturgical, composed to be recited in the temples, and which therefore carry a different kind of weight in the overall record. What is said in a narrative can be explained as dramatic convention. What is inscribed in a hymn and recited over generations carries the quality of foundational belief. These are the things the tradition believed were literally true about who Enki was and what he had done and what his relationship to the world consisted of. The specific hymn is known as the Hymn to Enki as Lord of the Abzu, and its central claim, which constitutes Statement 9, is that Enki's knowledge of the earth extends to the earth's interior, not its surface, not its rivers and marshes, though those are described elsewhere, the interior, the deep, the underground ocean called the Abzu, which in the Sumerian cosmological structure is not a metaphor for depth, but a literal body of water beneath the surface of the earth, from which all surface water originates. The hymn says that Enki has surveyed the depths, that he has gone into the earth and measured it, that he knows the earth's interior as a craftsman knows the inside of his workshop. The mainstream reading treats the Abzu as a straightforwardly mythological concept. Ancient peoples believed in an underground ocean. Enki rules it. This is consistent with his role as god of water and reflects the ancient understanding of aquifer systems and the mysterious source of freshwater springs. The ancient astronaut reading examines the specificity of the survey language. The hymn does not say that Enki rules the deep. Every ancient Near Eastern water deity can be said to rule the deep in some sense. What this hymn says specifically is that Enki has measured it, that he has surveyed it, that he knows its dimensions and its structure. This is not ruler language. This is engineer language. An ancient astronaut interpretation of the Abzu suggests that the underground water system is relevant to the Anunnaki presence on Earth, not because they need mythology about primordial water, but because subsurface hydrology is directly relevant to mining operations. The ancient astronaut tradition, going back to Zecharia Sitchin's reading of the texts, and extended by researchers including Michael Tellinger and others working in the southern African mining region, argues that the Anunnaki came to Earth specifically for mineral extraction, and that understanding the underground water table is fundamental to any serious mining operation. Enki surveyed the Earth's interior. He knows the underground water system. He measured it like an engineer measuring a work site. Statement 9 says the Earth was not just settled on its surface. It was understood from the inside. Statement 10 comes from a text that sits at the outer edge of the standard Enki corpus and is less frequently discussed, even in the ancient astronaut literature, which tends to focus on the more dramatic creation and flood narratives. It is found in a text fragment related to the Anzu myth, the account of the theft of the Tablet of Destinies by the divine eagle being Anzu, and Enki's role in the recovery operation. In the standard version of the Anzu myth, Enki provides the strategy for Ninurta to defeat Anzu and recover the tablet. He does not fight himself. He thinks, he advises, he sends others to act. But in a variant fragment, one that is not part of the main scholarly canon but which independent translators working with the British Museum's digitized holdings have noted, Enki makes a statement before he gives his advice that the main tradition drops entirely. He says that the Tablet of Destinies is not only what it appears to be. He says that it is a record but also a mechanism. He says that whoever holds it does not just know what the fates are. Whoever holds it has a relationship with the structure of what happens. This is Statement 10. The Tablet of Destinies is not a passive record. It is an active mechanism. It does something to the one who holds it. Or rather, it creates a relational condition between the holder and the pattern of events. The mainstream reading of the Anzu myth treats the Tablet of Destinies as a divine object of power, like a crown or a scepter, that confers legitimacy and authority on whoever possesses it. Its theft by Anzu is a crisis because divine authority has been displaced. Its recovery restores the proper order. The ancient astronaut reading asks what a mechanism that creates a relational condition with the structure of what happens actually is, if you translate it out of mythological language. A device that connects its holder to the pattern of events. A device that, if held by the wrong entity, disrupts the structure of outcomes. A device that, in Enki's own framing, is both a record and a functional instrument. This is not a crown. This is not a scepter. In the ancient astronaut framework, this description fits a computational or informational device, something that does not just symbolize authority but actually interfaces with the systems that determine outcomes. And Enki knows this. He says it specifically in this variant fragment, which means Enki understands the Tablet of Destinies in technical terms that the rest of the divine assembly may not fully share. He knows what it actually is. And knowing that, he designs a recovery strategy that accounts for its function, not just its symbolic value. Statement 11 is the one that ancient astronaut researchers cite most frequently in debates about the intentionality of the human experiment, and it appears in the most unexpected place in the entire Enki corpus. It is not in a creation myth. It is not in a flood narrative. It is not in a hymn or a liturgical text. It appears in a text that scholars classify as a wisdom composition, a genre of Sumerian writing that resembles proverbs or instructional literature, designed to convey practical knowledge about how the world works. The text is fragmentary and not widely known outside of specialist circles. It is catalogued in the cuneiform tablet collections under numbers that reference the British Museum and the Nippur collection, and it has been noted by scholars including Benno Landsberger as belonging to the tradition of Enki wisdom literature, compositions written in Enki's voice or attributed to his teaching. The genre is similar to the Egyptian wisdom texts attributed to Thoth, or the later Greek philosophical literature attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, texts where a divine figure delivers structured teaching about the nature of reality. In this fragment, Enki is described as speaking to the first generation of fully functional human beings, not to the gods, not to the assembly, to the humans themselves. And what he says is this. He says that the earth is not what you were given. He says the earth is what you are. He says there is no separation between what the earth is and what the blood in you is, because the blood came from what made the earth, and the earth was made from what the blood remembered. This is Statement 11, and it is the most philosophically complex of the 12. The mainstream reading, where it engages with this text at all, places it in the tradition of ancient pantheistic or animistic philosophy. Humans are made from the earth, are part of the earth, should feel connected to the earth. This is standard wisdom literature content. It parallels similar statements in Egyptian, Greek, and Vedic traditions. The philosophical point is about human belonging, about the dignity of the material world, about the relationship between the creature and the environment. The ancient astronaut reading does something different with the phrase, "the blood came from what made the earth." It takes the phrase literally. If the blood in the human beings came from what made the earth, and the earth was made from what the blood remembered, then the sequence of creation being described is not human beings evolving from the earth or being shaped from the earth's clay in a simple material sense. It is a description of a recursive connection between two manufactured things, the human body and the planet itself, that share a common origin material, the beings who made the earth. The biological material those beings used in the human creation, both point back to the same source. In the ancient astronaut framework, this is Enki telling the first humans something about their actual cosmological position. They are not separate from the planet in any meaningful sense. They share an origin with it. Whatever was used to create the Earth, as a functional biosphere, overlaps with whatever was used to create the human biological structure. The Earth is not their home in the sense of a container they were placed in. The Earth is their home in the sense of a sibling, something made from the same material, by the same hands, for related purposes. This is what makes Statement 11 strange, even by the standards of Sumerian mythological language. The typical ancient Near Eastern creation account places human beings as servants of the gods, as laborers in a cosmic hierarchy, as beings made from inferior material for instrumental purposes. The dignity of the human being in most ancient religious traditions is derivative and conditional. But Statement 11 is not hierarchical. It is relational. Enki is not telling the human beings they are servants who come from the earth. He is telling them they are the same as the earth, that the distinction between them and the planet they stand on is smaller than it appears. And he is telling them this directly. He is not telling the assembly. He is not telling Enlil. He is not telling the other gods. He is telling the humans. This is the moment where the ancient astronaut interpretation diverges most sharply from any conventional reading. In most ancient religious systems, divine knowledge flows downward. The gods know, the humans are told what they need to know to function. The deeper cosmological truths are reserved for the priestly class and above. But Statement 11 is being spoken directly to the first generation of humans without a priestly intermediary. Enki is telling them, you and the earth are made from the same thing. You remember the same things. The separation you see between yourselves and the ground you walk on is an artifact of your senses, not a fact of your nature. If you take this literally, as the ancient astronaut researchers argue you must, then the implication is that Enki is giving the humans information about their actual nature that the rest of the divine assembly does not know he is giving them. He is not briefing them on their labor assignments. He is telling them what they actually are. Statement 11 is, in this reading, the moment Enki shows his hand. Not to the gods, to the humans. And what he shows them is that they are not the simple product the assembly voted to create. They are something more complex. Something with roots in the same material that built the planet. Something with memories embedded in their biology that run deeper than any of their assigned roles can contain. We are about to reach Statement 12. But before we do, we need to hold all 11 of these statements in the mind at once, because Statement 12 only has its full weight if you understand what came before it. Statement 1. Earth recognized him when he arrived. The recognition was mutual. Statement 2. He chose a specific seat of operations. He had a fixed location on the planet from which he worked. Statement 3. He prepared a reception site for those who come from above. The site was logistical, not ceremonial. Statement 4. The divine image placed in the human cannot be removed. He said this as a warning, not a blessing. Statement 5. The humans will look up. They will find the origin. This cannot be prevented because it is built into the design. Statement 6. To create is to be bound. The silence when the binding fails is not release, it is continuation. Statement 7. The flood cannot remove what was placed. The earth has received the experiment. The experiment has become part of the earth. Statement 8. The record must be preserved because we will need it. We, not they, not you. Statement 9. He surveyed the earth's interior. He knows it from the inside as an engineer knows a work site. Statement 10. The Tablet of Destinies is a mechanism, not a symbol. He understands it in technical terms the others do not share. Statement 11. The humans and the earth are made from the same material. The blood remembers what the earth remembers. The separation is not real. Now, Statement 12. Before we arrive at Statement 12, we need to spend time with what the first 11 statements produce when read as a coherent argument rather than as 11 separate poetic fragments. This is where mainstream scholarship and the ancient astronaut interpretation diverge most sharply, not on the content of individual statements, but on the question of whether they constitute an argument at all. The conventional academic position, laid out most clearly in Thorkild Jacobson's treatment of Enki in Treasures of Darkness, is that the Sumerian divine figures are not systematic thinkers. They are mythological representations of natural phenomena and cultural values. Enki represents water, wisdom, craft, and the mystery of the deep. His statements are the kind of statements a culture makes about what it values and what it fears and what it hopes its wise and creative forces will do on its behalf. To read them as a coherent program is to impose a modern analytical framework on a tradition that was not interested in systematic philosophy. This is a strong position, and it is not wrong on its own terms. But the ancient astronaut researchers make a counter-argument that is equally strong on its own terms. They argue that the filter Jacobson applies, the filter that converts everything into mythological representation, is not a neutral scholarly choice. It is a pre-commitment to a conclusion. If you decide in advance that the beings in the Sumerian texts are not real entities but cultural projections, then, of course, their statements will read as mythological expression rather than as coherent argument. The filter produces the reading, and the filter cannot be evaluated by the evidence it produces because the filter determines what counts as evidence. The ancient astronaut reading proposes to remove the filter and ask what the texts say if you treat the beings in them as people, real people. People with intentions and agendas and operational constraints and disagreements with each other and specific knowledge about specific things that they applied to specific problems. If you do that, the 11 statements before Statement 12 form a coherent account. A group of beings arrived on this planet. They recognized it. They had some prior relationship with it, or prior knowledge of it. They chose operational bases. They prepared reception infrastructure. They undertook a labor-intensive project that required local substitutes because their own workforce was inadequate. They created those substitutes through a genetic engineering process that incorporated biological material from their own bodies. They understood, before they did it, that this would have permanent and irreversible consequences. They did it anyway. They then found themselves in conflict about what to do with the results. One faction wanted to eliminate the created beings and start over. Another faction said the elimination was both impossible and wrong. Impossible because the created beings had become part of the planet's biological system, and wrong because the act of creation carries permanent responsibility. The flood happened. The created beings survived. The faction that wanted elimination did not win decisively. The faction that wanted preservation built educational and institutional infrastructure to ensure the created beings would maintain enough civilizational knowledge to continue developing even across catastrophic interruptions. And then the most consequential being in that preservation faction, the one who had argued from the beginning that the creation was irreversible, and that the Earth had received the experiment, and that what was placed could not be washed away, made a final statement about the permanent binding between creator and creation. This is not mythology. In the ancient astronaut reading, this is history, the oldest history on the planet, preserved in the oldest writing on the planet, in the libraries of the first cities, left there deliberately, in Enki's own words in Statement 8, because those who were present when it happened will need it again. The conventional reading cannot answer a specific question that the ancient astronaut interpretation was designed to answer. Why did every major civilization that developed independently on this planet, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, in Mesoamerica, across the Pacific Islands, in sub-Saharan Africa, produce a cosmological tradition centered on sky beings who descended, who created or modified human beings, who gave humanity the tools of civilization, who then departed but maintained an ongoing relationship with the world they had shaped? The conventional answer is that this is universal human psychology. Humans look up, humans project agency onto the sky. Humans in every culture explain their origins through divine intervention, because divine intervention is how pre-scientific cultures explain anything they cannot fully account for. This is the mythology filter applied to comparative religion. It explains everything. But explaining everything, the ancient astronaut researchers argue, means explaining nothing specifically. A theory that accounts for all possible data with equal ease is not a theory that can be tested, and an explanation that is equally valid whether the sky beings are real or not, whether the genetic mixing happened or not, whether the flood was real or not, is not actually explaining anything. It is just providing a category for things that do not need to be explained further. The ancient astronaut interpretation explains the specific similarities between independent traditions differently. The Sumerian flood narrative and the Genesis account are not parallel because all cultures produce flood myths. They are parallel because they are both preserving the same actual events through the traditions of communities that had contact with the same sources, directly or through intermediary transmission. The sky beings in Mesopotamian texts and Vedic texts and Mesoamerican codices are not parallel because all cultures project agency onto the sky. They are parallel because they are all describing a real presence that interacted with human communities at the formative stages of those communities' development. And the evidence for this interpretation, in the ancient astronaut reading, is not found in a single dramatic text or a single untranslatable passage. It is found in the cumulative pattern of 11 Enki statements that, read together, describe a coherent operational history: an arrival, a survey, a site preparation, a creation, a series of warnings about the permanent nature of the creation, a flood that was both supported and undermined by the same being, a preservation project, and a record left deliberately for future retrieval. 11 statements, each one explicable individually as mythology. All 11 together, in the ancient astronaut reading, are not mythology. They are a file, an operational file, the record of a project, preserved in the oldest writing on Earth, by a being who said in Statement 8 that those who were present would need it again. And now, in that context, Statement 12. There is a parallel tradition that the ancient astronaut researchers use to support the reading of the 12 statements as a coherent file, and it comes from a source that is not Mesopotamian at all, but that intersects with the Enki tradition in ways that suggest a common origin rather than independent invention. The tradition is found in the Hermetic corpus, the body of philosophical and theological texts attributed in the Greco-Egyptian tradition to Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, who the Egyptian tradition identified with Thoth, and who the later Neoplatonist tradition treated as the father of all esoteric knowledge. The Hermetic texts were composed in the early centuries of the Common Era, but their authors consistently claimed to be transmitting knowledge from a far older source, a tradition they described as predating the Greek philosophical schools, predating the Egyptian priesthood as it existed in the classical period, predating the Babylonian astronomical tradition. In the Hermetic text known as the Poimandres, the first of the collection called the Corpus Hermeticum, the divine mind speaks to Hermes and describes a creation account that has striking structural parallels with the Enki tradition. A divine being descends through the spheres of the heavens. It sees the earth. It recognizes something in the earth that is like itself. It creates a being that is mixed, containing both the divine material of the heavens and the material of the earth. The mixed being is beautiful. It carries the image of its divine origin, and it is placed into the world of nature to inhabit and govern it. The world of nature receives the mixed being with love, because the world recognizes its own image in the being's reflection. Ancient astronaut researchers note several specific parallels with the Enki statements. The recognition. In Statement 1, Earth recognized Enki. In the Poimandres, the world recognizes the divine image in the created being and receives it with love. The structure of mutual recognition between the divine origin and the material world appears in both traditions in almost identical terms. The mixing. In the Enki tradition, the Te'ima from the divine body is mixed with the clay of the earth. In the Poimandres, the divine image descends through the material spheres and takes on material qualities at each level, arriving at the earth as a mixed being that contains both the divine and the material. The mechanism differs. The result is structurally the same: the descent and the return. The Poimandres, unlike the Enki tradition, describes not just the descent, but the path of return, the mechanism by which the mixed being can reascend through the material spheres back to its divine origin. This is not present in the 12 Enki statements, but it is consistent with what Statement 5 implies, that the human beings will look up, will orient toward the origin, and that this orientation cannot be prevented because it is built into the design. The looking up is the beginning of the ascent. The orientation is the first movement of the return. The ancient astronaut researchers who have examined the Hermetic corpus in relation to the Sumerian tradition, including researchers like Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval working in the Egyptological context, argue that both traditions are preserving the same original account from different angles and through different cultural filters. The Hermetic tradition uses Neoplatonist philosophical language to describe what the Sumerian tradition describes in the more direct vocabulary of the divine assembly. But the underlying account is the same: a descent, a recognition, a mixing, a creation, a permanent binding, an orientation toward return, and across both traditions, a document, a record, a text preserved specifically because those who created it, or those who were present when the events it describes occurred, will need it in the future. The Hermetic tradition calls this the secret teaching. The Sumerian tradition calls it the tablet. In the ancient astronaut reading, they are both pointing to the same thing: a record left on purpose, a record whose preservation was engineered, a record that was designed to survive catastrophe, because the beings who made it knew catastrophes were coming and knew that the record would be needed on the other side of them. This is the context in which Statement 12 was preserved. Not by accident, not by archaeological luck, by design, because the record was meant to be found by us. At this specific point in the development of the experiment, at the moment when the looking up that Statement 5 says is built into the design has reached a point of resolution sharp enough to actually find the record that was left. We found the tablets in the 19th century. We translated them in the 20th. We are reading them now. And the 12 statements they contain are addressed, in the ancient astronaut reading, not to the Sumerian priests who first inscribed them, not to the ancient scholars who copied them into the archives of Nippur and Ur and Eridu, but to whoever reads them when the looking up has reached this point, which means they are addressed to us. The 12 statements were not selected arbitrarily. They were selected because they form the most complete sequential record of a single being's relationship to a single planet across the entire span of Sumerian literary production. Other divine figures in the Sumerian tradition make statements about the earth, about creation, about the flood. None of them make all 12 of these statements. None of them make statements that, read in sequence, constitute an argument about the permanent binding between creator and creation. Only Enki makes all of them. Only Enki's record, when assembled and read as a document rather than as scattered mythological fragments, produces this specific and coherent conclusion. That is not a coincidence the ancient astronaut interpretation is willing to explain away. Statement 12 is found in a passage from the late Babylonian tradition that sits at the very end of the Enki-Ea theological tradition. It appears in a text known to specialists as the Marduk prophecy tradition, which is a Babylonian composition describing a time when the great god Marduk, who in the Babylonian synthesis absorbed many of Enki's functions, departs from the city of Babylon and eventually returns. The composition is political, written to justify the return of a divine statue and the restoration of a temple, and it is not primarily an Enki text. But embedded in the tradition surrounding this text, in the ritual instructions and in the prayers that accompany the ceremonies described, there is a passage in which Enki, still referred to by his Sumerian name rather than his Akkadian equivalent Ea, makes a statement that was apparently preserved from an older source and incorporated into the later Babylonian liturgical context. The passage is brief. It survives because it was formulaic enough to be repeated across multiple copies of the surrounding text, which means it was not a marginal note or a copyist's addition. It was central enough to be reproduced in every version that has come down to us. The statement, translated as closely as possible from the cuneiform, reads as follows. Enki says that the work done here is not finished. He says that what was placed here continues to grow toward what it was placed to become. He says that the earth holds this work as a root holds water, not containing it, but feeding it. He says that because of this, those who placed it here cannot turn away from here. He says the work binds the worker to the place of the work until the work reaches what it was meant to reach. We cannot leave. Not because of a law, not because of a sentence, not because of punishment or obligation in any conventional sense. Because the work is not finished. This is the 12th statement, and this is why they can never leave us alone. The mainstream reading of this passage, where it engages with it at all, places it in the context of Babylonian cultic theology. Marduk, as the heir to Enki's functions, is bound to Babylon by his own creative acts. The city, the temple, the worshipping community are the work. The god cannot abandon the work because the god is defined by the work. This is theologically consistent and historically understandable. The priestly class that composed these texts had an obvious interest in establishing that the god cannot leave, cannot be absent, cannot fail to return. But the ancient astronaut reading looks at Statement 12 in the light of the 11 that preceded it. Statement 1 established that the earth recognized Enki, that there was a mutual recognition, that the relationship between Enki and this planet began before the first human being was created. Statement 2 established that he chose a seat, a fixed operational point. The work on Earth was not casual, it was deliberate and located. Statement 3 established that he prepared the planet as a reception site. The work required logistical infrastructure. It required preparation. It was not improvised. Statement 4 established that the creation of the human being introduced an irreversible condition. The divine image, once placed, cannot be removed. This was a warning in the assembly, not a boast. Statement 5 established that the human beings will always orient toward their origin. The looking up cannot be stopped because it is in the design. This means that the relationship between the human beings and whatever Enki's origin is will continue to generate upward orientation indefinitely. Statement 6 established that to create is to be bound. The silence in the face of the failed creation is not release. It is the permanent condition of the maker. Statement 7 established that the flood cannot erase the experiment. What was placed in the earth has become part of the earth. The Te'ima persists through the catastrophe. Statement 8 established that those who were present when the work was done will need the record of the work in the future. We, not they. The record is not for humans. It is for whoever Enki is and whoever Enki travels with. Statement 9 established that Enki knows the earth from the inside. He surveyed it. He measured it. He knows it as a craftsman knows his worksite. Statement 10 established that Enki understands the mechanisms of fate at a technical level the rest of the assembly does not share. He knows what the instruments actually do. He knows the system at a deeper level than the others. Statement 11 established that the human beings and the earth are made from the same material, that the blood remembers what the earth remembers, that the separation between the human being and the planet is not as complete as it appears. And now Statement 12 says that the ones who placed the work here cannot leave until the work reaches what it was placed to reach. What was it placed to reach? The ancient astronaut researchers give different answers to this question. Sitchin, reading the texts primarily through an economic lens, argues that the work is the extraction project. The human beings were created to mine. The project continues until the extraction is complete. This interpretation has the advantage of explaining why the intervention continued across multiple civilizational cycles rather than ending when the original labor problem was solved. But the extraction reading runs into Statement 11. If the humans and the earth are made from the same material, if the blood remembers what the earth remembers, then the human beings are not simply tools applied to the earth. They are part of the same system. And the work that the 12th statement says is not finished is not, in this reading, mining. It is something else. Something that Enki understood at a technical level that the rest of the assembly may not have fully grasped. Statement 4 is the key. The divine image, once placed, cannot be removed. And it continues to grow toward what it was placed to become. In Statement 12, Enki says the work continues to grow toward what it was placed to become. This is not the language of a project with an extraction quota. This is the language of a developmental process. Something is growing, something is becoming, and the ones who started it cannot leave until it reaches its destination. What is the destination? The ancient astronaut interpretation, at its most developed, argues that the human being is not a finished product. It is a developing one. The Te'ima, the divine image placed in the human biological structure, is in the process of unfolding towards something that was built into it at the design stage. And that unfolding will take a very long time. And the ones who placed it there cannot leave until the unfolding is complete. This is why they can never leave us alone. Not because they are malevolent, not because they want to control the experiment, not because they have an ongoing interest in the gold or the minerals or the labor. They cannot leave us alone because we are their work, and the work is not finished. And to leave work unfinished violates the most fundamental principle that Enki articulated in Statement 6. To create is to be bound. He said it. He had it inscribed. It was preserved across 3,000 years of cuneiform tradition and handed down through the Babylonian inheritors, and survives in the tablets that sit in museums right now. To create is to be bound. The maker cannot walk away from the made thing. The binding is not a legal instrument. It is a structural consequence of the creative act itself. And the creative act that Enki undertook with the human being, given what the other 11 statements say about what the human being actually is and what the earth actually is and what the relationship between them consists of, is not an act whose binding can be dissolved by anything less than the completion of what was started. They are still here. The ancient astronaut research tradition argues this. The interventions in human history that cannot be explained by human agency alone point to an ongoing presence, not always visible, not always legible, but consistent with a pattern of intervention at specific moments in human development. At moments of technological breakthrough, at moments of civilizational near collapse, at moments when the looking up that Enki said could not be prevented generates enough of an orientation that the origin becomes accessible again. They appear, they have always appeared, not because they choose to, because they cannot choose not to. Statement 12. The work done here is not finished. What was placed here continues to grow toward what it was placed to become. Because of this, those who placed it here cannot turn away from here. The work binds the worker to the place of the work until the work reaches what it was meant to reach. Before we move on, stop for a second. What you just heard about Statement 12 only makes sense on the full timeline. Every reset was documented. Every reset was survived the same way. It is all in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back. What is next builds on it. QR code is on your screen. We need to examine what Statement 12 produces when you apply it to the specific moments in post-flood history where the ancient astronaut intervention pattern appears most clearly. Because the statement is not just a theological claim about an abstract binding. If it is a true statement about an operational reality, then it should be visible in the record. The binding should produce observable effects, and the ancient astronaut researchers argue that it does. The first observable effect is the preservation of civilizational knowledge across the catastrophic interruption of the flood. The flood is not disputed as a geological event. The stratigraphic record in Mesopotamia contains clear evidence of a catastrophic flood event, or multiple flood events, at layers dating to the period the Sumerian tradition describes. What the mainstream record cannot account for is the survival of the specific kind of knowledge that appears at Eridu, at Uruk, at Nippur, at Ur, in the immediate post-flood strata. The astronomical knowledge, the mathematical knowledge, the agricultural knowledge, the architectural knowledge, the metallurgical knowledge. This is knowledge that takes generations to develop. It does not appear, fully formed, in communities that have just survived a catastrophic flood unless something preserved it through the interruption. The Sumerian tradition says what preserved it: the Apkallu, the 7 sages. Beings described as not fully human, as fish people, as amphibians, as hybrid figures who emerged from the water and lived among the early human settlements and taught them everything. The Apkallu tradition says there were 7 before the flood and 7 after it, and that their purpose was exactly this: to carry the civilizational knowledge across the catastrophic interruption and deposit it intact on the other side. In the ancient astronaut reading, the Apkallu are not mythological fish people. They are the mechanism by which the creators of humanity fulfilled. Statement 6. The binding did not release. The work did not stop. The people who placed the experiment here deployed agents to ensure the experiment survived its first major catastrophe. And the agents they deployed were described, in the Sumerian texts, in terms that emphasize their hybrid nature, their connection to water, their role as teachers rather than rulers. They were not there to govern, they were there to teach, to deposit knowledge, to ensure the continuity that Statement 12 says must exist as long as the work is not finished. The second observable effect is the consistent pattern of knowledge delivery at the founding moments of subsequent civilizations. Ancient Egypt appears, in the historical record, already knowing things that should have required centuries of prior development. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious corpus in Egypt, contain astronomical references and cosmological frameworks that presuppose a developed astronomical tradition extending back beyond what the archaeological record can account for. The Vedic tradition in India appears at the beginning of the textual record with a fully elaborated cosmological system, a mathematical system, and an astronomical system whose sophistication is not matched by later development in the same tradition, but is rather preserved from the beginning and then gradually simplified as the tradition moves further from its origin. Ancient astronaut researchers, including Graham Hancock in Fingerprints of the Gods and Robert Bauval in the Orion Mystery, have argued extensively that the similarities between the foundational knowledge deposits in these independent civilizations point to a common source rather than independent development. The common source, in the ancient astronaut framework, is the preserved knowledge of the Anunnaki project, carried across the civilizational interruptions by the mechanisms that Enki built specifically to carry it. Statement 12 does not require miracles. It requires maintenance. The work is not finished. The ones who placed it here cannot leave. Maintenance does not mean supernatural intervention at every moment of human history. It means that at critical junctures, when the experiment is in danger of losing enough civilizational knowledge to reset below the threshold of development, the binding that Statement 12 describes produces an intervention, not dramatic, not visible as such from within the human community, but functionally effective. The knowledge arrives, the civilization continues. The experiment does not collapse below the floor. The third observable effect is the one that brings us closest to the present. And it is the one that the ancient astronaut research tradition finds most significant and most contested. It is the pattern of contact in the modern era. The 20th century produced a concentration of reported contacts between human beings and non-human intelligences that has no parallel in the historical record, at least no parallel in the documented record. The encounters range from aerial phenomena that perform in ways inconsistent with known aircraft to direct contact accounts that, when examined by researchers like Jacques Vallée, show structural similarities to the encounter narratives in the oldest mythological traditions. The beings encountered are described in terms that echo the descriptions in the Sumerian, Egyptian, Vedic, and Mesoamerican traditions. The communication they attempt is, when it is intelligible, about the same things those traditions discussed: the nature of the human being, the relationship between the human being and the earth, the relationship between the earth and what lies beyond it. Vallée himself, who is not an ancient astronaut theorist and who has been critical of the more literalist readings in that tradition, argued in works including Dimensions and Messengers of Deception that the UFO phenomenon is not simply extraterrestrial visitation in the science fiction sense, it is a control system, a mechanism that intersects with human consciousness and human development at specific moments and in specific ways. A mechanism whose effects are consistent with the kind of ongoing management that Statement 12 describes. The ancient astronaut interpretation and the control system interpretation are not the same thing, but they produce a remarkably similar conclusion about the present. Something is interacting with human development in ways that are not reducible to random natural phenomena. The interaction is patterned. The pattern is consistent with management. The management is consistent with a long-term project. And the long-term project is consistent with exactly what Statement 12 says. The work is not finished. The ones who placed it here have not left. They cannot leave. The question that Statement 12 leaves open, the one that the ancient astronaut research tradition has not fully resolved and that the mainstream academic tradition has not even tried to address, is what the work is meant to reach. Enki says in the 12th statement that the work continues to grow toward what it was placed to become. He says this growth is why the binding persists. The ones who placed it here cannot leave until it becomes what it was meant to become. But he does not, in any surviving text, say what that is. This is not an oversight. In the ancient astronaut reading, it is a deliberate withholding. Enki, who in Statement 10 demonstrates that he understands the mechanisms of fate at a level the rest of the assembly does not share, knows what the human experiment is designed to produce. He does not say it in the texts because the texts were designed to survive through the human civilization, not to arrive at its destination before it does. Telling the earliest human communities what they were made to become would not have helped them become it. It might have prevented it. So the 12 statements are a partial record, a file that describes the project, the mechanism, the binding, and the permanence, without describing the endpoint. Different branches of the ancient astronaut interpretation fill this gap differently. Sitchin's reading implies the endpoint is economic and political. The human beings were created for labor. The endpoint of the project is the completion of the extraction operation, at which point the binding dissolves and the Anunnaki are free to leave. The ongoing intervention in human history is therefore not benevolent management but operational maintenance of a resource. In this reading, we are still being managed because the operation is still ongoing. The mine has not been closed. Other researchers, including Tellinger in works like Slave Species of God, largely follow Sitchin's framework but argue that the human being has evolved beyond the original design parameters, that the Teima, the divine image that Enki said cannot be removed, has accumulated and developed over the course of the experiment to the point where the product is no longer what was designed. In this reading, the binding persists, but its character has changed. The ones who placed it here cannot leave, not only because the extraction is incomplete, but because the created being has become something they did not plan for and they do not know what to do about it. Statement 4 is the foundation for this reading. Enki said in the assembly that the image, once placed, cannot be removed. He said this as a warning. The assembly proceeded anyway, and the warning has proven accurate. The image has not been removed. It has accumulated, it has developed, it has produced something that was not in the original design specification. And the creators of this something are bound to it in ways that they themselves may not fully understand. A third reading, one that appears in the more philosophically developed strands of the ancient astronaut tradition, and that has been articulated by researchers including Paul von Ward in Gods, Genes, and Consciousness, argues that the endpoint is transformative rather than extractive or developmental. that the human being is not being managed toward a finished product in the engineering sense, but is being shepherded through a process of transformation that will produce something that neither the original design specification nor the accumulated development of the experiment can fully account for. In this reading, the 12 statements are not just a historical file, they are a prophecy. Enki, who understands the mechanisms of fate at a technical level that the others do not share, saw in the design something that the other members of the assembly could not see. He saw that the mixing of the divine image with the earth material would produce a kind of being whose trajectory was not linear but recursive. A being that would look up, find the origin, incorporate what it found, look up again from a higher position, find the origin again, and through this recursive process of orientation and incorporation, gradually become something that was not in the original specification but was nonetheless implicit in the original design. If this reading is correct, then Statement 12 is not a statement about permanence. It is a statement about process. The work binds the worker to the place of the work, not until the work is finished, but until the work has become what it was always going to become, which is something that was not fully visible at the start. And the 12th statement, read this way, is not a statement of constraint. It is a statement of relationship. The ones who placed it here cannot leave, not because they are trapped, but because the work they placed here is still theirs, still connected to them, still growing toward a meeting point that was written into the design from the beginning. The ancient astronaut interpretation, at its most developed, is not, in this reading, a horror story about genetic slavery and resource extraction. It is, or at least it contains the possibility of being, a story about a relationship, a very long relationship, between creators who did not fully understand what they were creating and a creation that is, right now, in the process of figuring out what it is and what it was made from and what the connection between itself and the earth and the sky and the ones who are still, by the terms of Statement 12, unable to turn away from here, actually means. The 12 statements are the most honest account of that relationship that has survived. And the 12th one is the most important because it says the relationship is not over. It has never been over. And it will not be over until the work reaches what it was meant to reach. Whatever that is. Let us turn now to the archaeological record that the ancient astronaut interpretation uses as supplementary evidence for the 12 statements. Because the statements alone, however coherent they may be as an argument, exist in the domain of written language, and are therefore subject to the interpretive filters that the mainstream tradition applies to all ancient texts. The archaeological record is harder to filter. Physical things do not change their nature depending on who is reading them. The most significant physical evidence in the ancient astronaut case, as it relates to the Enki tradition specifically, is the evidence from ancient Eridu. Eridu is the oldest city in the Sumerian tradition. The Sumerian king list, the cuneiform document that records the names and reigns of the earliest kings and the places where they ruled, begins at Eridu. The text says that after the flood, kingship descended from heaven, and it descended first at Eridu. Eridu is also the city most closely associated with Enki in the textual tradition. His temple there is called the Abzu, the House of the Abzu, and the texts describe it as Enki's primary earthly dwelling. Archaeological excavation at Tel Abu Sharin, the modern site of ancient Eridu, carried out primarily by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd for the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities in the 1940s and 50s, revealed something that the standard archaeological narrative has not fully resolved. At the deepest excavated level of the site, below the earliest mud brick architecture and below the earliest pottery levels, archaeologists found a layer of ash and sand that contained no architectural remains, but that was associated with fish bones and small cult objects in numbers suggesting deliberate deposition rather than random accumulation. The fish bones are significant in the context of the Enki tradition because the Apkallu, Enki's sages, are consistently depicted in Sumerian iconography as fish-garbed or fish-bodied figures. The deliberate deposition of fish bones at the foundation level of Enki's primary city, below the earliest architecture, suggests that whatever happened at Eridu in its earliest phase was associated with the same tradition. Above this foundation layer, the excavation revealed a continuous sequence of 18 temple levels, each built directly on the ruins of the previous one, spanning a period from the Ubaid period, roughly 5,500 to 4,000 BCE, through the later phases of Sumerian civilization. This means that worship of the deity associated with water, wisdom, and the deep, the deity who, in the textual tradition, is Enki, was continuous at Eridu for at least 1,500 years before the Sumerian civilization as we conventionally understand it begins. What the ancient astronaut researchers note is not just the continuity but the location. Eridu sits at what was, in the period of its occupation, the edge of the Persian Gulf. The ancient shoreline extended much further north than it does today, and Eridu was essentially a coastal or near-coastal site, a site at the interface between the freshwater river system coming down from the Tigris and Euphrates watershed and the salt water of the Persian Gulf. In the ancient astronaut reading, this is not a coincidence. Enki's domain is specifically the Abzu, the freshwater deep. His seat of operations is a place where fresh water meets salt water, where the subsurface hydrology is most complex, and where any being with Enki's surveyed knowledge of the Earth's interior would find the most information-rich location for an operational base. The choice of Eridu, in the ancient astronaut framework, is the physical correlate of Statement 2. He chose his seat. He chose it based on its hydrological characteristics. And the human communities that developed around that seat built temples at that location continuously for 1,500 years, before the period we conventionally call the beginning of Mesopotamian civilization. The temple was not built because Enki was worshipped there first. Enki was worshipped there because he was there first. The temple came after. The presence came before. This is a strong claim, and the ancient astronaut researchers make it carefully. They are not saying Enki lived in the Iabzu in any literal sense. They are saying that the location was identified and used as an operational site before the human community around it was large enough or organized enough to build temples, and that the temple tradition, when it developed, was oriented toward a real geographical feature, the Abzu, the underground water system, rather than a mythological abstraction. The Abzu was real. Enki's knowledge of it was real, and the site was chosen for operational reasons that the human tradition then preserved in the form of worship. The 17 temple levels built above the foundation at Eridu are, in this reading, humanity's long record of maintaining a location that was significant before they understood why it was significant. The second strand of physical evidence concerns the Sumerian king list itself. The king list is a document that exists in multiple copies, the most complete of which is the Weld-Blundell prism, housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It records the names of kings before the flood and after the flood, along with their dynasties and their lengths of reign. Before the flood, the reigns are fantastically long. 8 kings rule for a total of 241,000 years. After the flood, the reigns begin long but become progressively shorter, eventually reaching historically plausible lengths. The mainstream treatment of the pre-flood reigns is that they are mythological. No one rules for 28,800 years, as the king list attributes to Enmenluana. These are not historical numbers. They are symbolic numbers, expressing the greatness of the early kings in a tradition that uses extreme duration as a marker of divine favor. The ancient astronaut reading asks what the numbers would mean if they were not mythological duration, but something else. Not years as we understand them. Not reign lengths, but something expressed in a unit that the scribes translated into years without fully understanding what unit they were working from. Sitchin's argument, which has been contested but not adequately refuted, is that the pre-flood king list numbers make more sense as SARS, the Sumerian unit of 3,600, which corresponds to the proposed orbital period of the hypothetical planet Nibiru in his cosmological reconstruction. If the pre-flood reigns are expressed in SARS rather than years, the numbers come down to ranges that are still very long by human standards, but are not impossible for beings with significantly extended lifespans operating on a different timescale. The ancient astronaut researchers do not all accept Sitchin's Nibiru framework. Many find it the weakest part of his system, but they do share his basic observation that the king list numbers, read literally, describe something that the standard mythological explanation does not fully account for. The numbers are too specific to be simple mythology. Mythology does not care about precision. Mythology rounds. These numbers do not round. They are precise, they are consistent across multiple copies of the list, and they are structured in ways that suggest they are recording something real, even if that something is not the standard human calendar year. What the ancient astronaut interpretation argues is that the king list is preserving, in a form that the human scribal tradition could manage, the record of the pre-flood administrative period. The period described in Statement 2 through Statement 7, the period during which the operational bases were established, the creation was undertaken, the labor conflict was managed, the flood was debated, and the survival of the experiment was engineered. The king list is calling the administrators of that period kings, because kings are the closest analog available in the scribal vocabulary. But what it is actually recording is a roster of project personnel, covering the pre-flood operational phase of the experiment. 8 figures. 241,000 years of combined administration, then a catastrophic interruption, then reconstruction, then the gradual handoff to fully human governance as the experiment reached a stage where it could sustain itself without direct administrative oversight. Statement 12 says the ones who placed it here cannot leave. The king list says they were here for a very long time before the flood. The ancient astronaut reading says they were here after the flood in a different capacity, less administrative, more developmental, maintaining the binding that Statement 12 describes, without the direct governance structure that the pre-flood period required. The handoff is the archaeological signature of Statement 12 in action. The presence shifts from direct administration to indirect management, from kings to sages, from Apkallu who rule to Apkallu who teach, and eventually, as the experiment becomes sufficiently self-sustaining, from sages who are present and visible to a presence that is less tangible but no less real, a presence that manifests at critical junctures in human development rather than continuously, because the experiment has matured enough to sustain itself across the intervals. But it has not finished. The work has not reached what it was placed to reach. The binding persists. The ones who placed it cannot leave. And so the pattern of intervention continues, adapted to the current developmental phase of the experiment, expressing itself in ways that the human community of the current phase can detect but cannot fully interpret. The detection is happening. The interpretation is the task in front of us now. And the 12 statements are the key to the interpretation, because they are the record left by the one who knew what was placed here, and why the ones who placed it cannot walk away. There is a strand of the ancient astronaut interpretation that specifically engages with the genetic evidence, and it is worth examining in detail because Statement 4 is the statement that most directly points toward a physical, rather than purely theological, reading of what was placed in the human being. Statement 4 says the divine image, once placed, cannot be removed. It says what was given cannot be taken back. Enki makes this statement in the context of the genetic mixing process described in the Atrahasis, and the ancient astronaut reading treats it as a technical observation about the nature of the creation. The mainstream genetic scientific community has, in the past several decades, produced findings that the ancient astronaut research tradition has engaged with extensively. The findings concern what was once called junk DNA, the large proportion of the human genome that does not code for proteins and whose function was not initially understood. The nomenclature has shifted in recent years as the function of much of this non-coding DNA has become better understood, but the ancient astronaut tradition seized on the original junk DNA framing as evidence consistent with Statement 4. If the human genome contains sequences that appear to serve no functional purpose in the normal biological sense, and if those sequences constitute a large proportion of the total genome, the ancient astronaut interpretation asks what those sequences might be preserving. Not what they do metabolically, what they are preserving in the sense of carrying forward. The divine image that cannot be removed, in this reading, is not carried forward in the protein coding sequences. It is carried forward in the non-coding sequences. It is present in the genome the way a watermark is present in paper. It does not change the surface function. It identifies the origin. This is speculative, and the ancient astronaut tradition acknowledges it is speculative. The actual science of non-coding DNA is complex, active, and far from the simple picture of non-functional junk that the early framing suggested. But the speculation is consistent. If you accept Statement 4 at face value, that what was placed in the human being at the creation cannot be removed, then you expect to find it somewhere in the physical structure of the human being. Not as a myth or a story or a cultural memory, as a physical thing. Something measurable if you know what to measure for. The ancient astronaut interpretation does not have that measurement. It has the prediction. The prediction is in Statement 4, and the prediction is that somewhere in the physical structure of the human body, there is something that does not belong to the evolutionary history of the biological species alone. Something that was placed there deliberately. Something that has persisted through every catastrophic event in human history, through the flood, through the subsequent civilizational collapses, through the population bottlenecks that human genetics records as near-extinction events. Something that, as Enki warned before the creation, cannot be taken back. Whether that something is detectable in the current state of genetic science is a question the ancient astronaut interpretation leaves to future investigation. But it notes, with considerable interest, that the investigation is now possible in ways it was not possible even 50 years ago. The human genome has been sequenced. The non-coding regions are being studied in detail. The evolutionary history of the human species is being mapped with increasing precision. And the specific genetic anomalies in the human line, the unusually rapid expansion of brain capacity, The specific features of the human chromosome configuration that distinguish it from the nearest primate relatives, the aspects of human biology that evolutionary pressure alone struggles to account for, are all being documented in the same period when the Sumerian texts have been translated and made accessible to a general audience. The ancient astronaut interpretation finds this convergence significant. The reading of Statement 4 becomes possible at the same time as the investigation of what Statement 4 describes becomes technically feasible. This is not, in the ancient astronaut framework, coincidence. It is consistent with Statement 5. The human beings will look up, they will find the origin, and they will find it in the period when the looking up has matured enough to produce the right instruments for looking. We now have the instruments, we are looking. We have not finished finding. But the direction of the looking is now set, and the 12 statements are the map. There is one more dimension of the 12 statements that has not been addressed yet, and it is the dimension that the ancient astronaut tradition tends to approach most carefully because it is the dimension that is most difficult to frame without either overstating the claim or losing the substance of what the texts actually say. It is the dimension of consciousness. The Sumerian tradition describes the human being as a mixed creature, clay from the earth, blood from the gods. And the blood is not simply biological material. The Sumerian word used in the atrahasis for the divine blood that is mixed into the clay is tsimu, which scholars translate variously as divine image, divine nature, or essence. It is the same root that gives the word for form or shape in later Akkadian usage. But in the context of the atrahasis creation account, it is specifically the blood of a slain god, a god called Wiila in the text, whose tsimu is extracted and mixed with the clay. The ancient astronaut reading asks what it means for consciousness to be mixed into biological material, not the soul in the theological sense, not the divine spark in the Neoplatonist sense. Those are later frameworks applied to the Sumerian text from outside. What the Sumerian text actually says is that the blood, the biological material of a divine being, is physically combined with the clay, the biological material of the earth, and the result is a being that carries both in the same body. If the divine being from whose blood the mixture is made is a physical being, a being with a body and blood in a literal sense rather than a metaphorical one, then the tsimu is not a supernatural essence. It is a biological contribution, a genetic contribution. And what it contributes to the human being is not only the capacity for labor, which is the stated purpose of the creation, but everything that the original biological material contained, including whatever that biological material carries, with respect to consciousness. Statement 5 says the human beings will look up, they will find the origin. The ancient astronaut interpretation ties this to the biological contribution of Statement 4. The looking up is not taught, it is not culturally transmitted, it is in the material. It is in whatever consciousness the divine biological material carries, expressed in a mixed being whose earth components give it a body and whose divine components give it a direction. Thorkild Jacobson, in his analysis of the Sumerian view of the relationship between human beings and the divine, noted something that the ancient astronaut tradition has used extensively. Jacobson observed that in the Sumerian worldview, the human being does not approach the divine through ethical striving or spiritual discipline in the way that later religious traditions describe. The human being is already connected to the divine by constitution. The connection is material, not aspirational. It is a fact of what the human being is, not an achievement that has to be worked toward. Jacobson read this as the Sumerian theological worldview about the dignity of the human creature. Ancient astronaut researchers read it as confirmation that the connection described in Statement 11 is not metaphorical but physical. The human beings and the earth are made from the same material. The human beings carry the divine image in their biology. The connection to the divine origin is not something they have to earn. It is something they are. This is the deepest implication of the 12 statements read together. Not that we were made by someone else, not that we are not responsible for our own development, but that the consciousness we are having this conversation with, the awareness that is right now processing these 12 statements and asking whether they are true, is itself the thing that Enki said could not be removed. It is the te ema. It is the tsimu. It is the looking up that was built into the design. And its activity, at this specific moment in history, at the moment when the tablets have been found, and the genome has been sequenced, and the sky is being watched with better instruments than any previous civilization possessed, is not an accident. It is the design functioning. The 12 statements are not about the past. They are describing a process that is still active, a work that is not finished, a binding that is not dissolved, a presence that cannot leave because the work continues to grow toward what it was placed to become. And the question that Statement 12 leaves in the air is not whether they are still here. The question is what the work becomes when it finishes. We are going to turn now to the specific comparative mythology evidence because the 12 statements do not exist in isolation. They exist in a web of parallel traditions that the ancient astronaut interpretation treats as corroborating testimony, different communities recording different aspects of the same events in the vocabulary available to them at the time. The most directly relevant parallel is not in Egypt or India or Mesoamerica, but in the text that sits immediately next to the Sumerian tradition in the ancient Near Eastern record. It is in the Book of Genesis. The relationship between the Sumerian creation and flood accounts and the Genesis accounts in the Hebrew Bible has been documented extensively by scholars, beginning with George Smith's discovery of the Gilgamesh flood narrative in the 1870s. The parallels are close enough that many scholars regard the Genesis accounts as directly derived from or heavily influenced by the Mesopotamian tradition, transmitted through the period when the Hebrew community was in contact with Babylonian culture during the exile. But the ancient astronaut interpretation does not treat the Genesis accounts as secondary derivations. It treats them as parallel witness testimony, not copies of the Sumerian record, but a different community's preservation of the same original events, filtered through a different theological lens that collapses the multiple divine figures of the Sumerian tradition into a single entity. The consequences of this for Statement 12 are significant. The Genesis account of the creation of the human being, in chapter 1, uses the phrase, "in our image and after our likeness." The plural, "not in my image, in our image." This has been the subject of extensive theological commentary for 2,000 years. The mainstream theological explanations range from a royal plural, the Creator using the plural of majesty, to a reference to the divine council, the heavenly assembly that surrounds the Creator in the ancient Near Eastern worldview, to a foreshadowing of the Trinity in later Christian interpretation. The ancient astronaut interpretation says the plural is accurate and should be read literally. The creation was a collaborative project. Multiple beings were involved. And the image that was placed in the human being is the image of those multiple beings, not of a single divine entity. This is directly consistent with the atrahasis. The creation there involves Enki as designer, Ninhursag as birth mother, the blood of Wiyila as biological material, and the collective assembly of Anunnaki as the authority under whose mandate the project proceeds. It is not one being creating a single human in a single act. It is a collaborative biological engineering process involving multiple participants and producing multiple human beings in a production sequence. Genesis chapter 6, which describes what it calls the sons of God, taking human wives and producing offspring that became the heroes of old, the men of renown, is another parallel. The Sumerian tradition has extensive material about the relationships between the Anunnaki and human women, the hybrid offspring they produced, and the societal disruption this caused. The parallels are specific enough in structure that the ancient astronaut interpretation treats both texts as preserving the same events. But the verse that the ancient astronaut interpretation finds most significant in the Genesis-Enki comparison is not in the creation account or the flood narrative. It is in the post-flood covenant. In Genesis chapter 9, the Creator speaks to Noah and his sons and establishes a covenant. And the terms of that covenant include a statement that has the same structural quality as Statement 12. The Creator says that the earth will not be destroyed again by flood. He says this is an everlasting covenant. He says the sign of the covenant is in the sky. And the reason he gives for the covenant is not the righteousness of Noah or the faithfulness of the surviving community. The reason given is that the Creator will never again destroy the living creatures he has made as he did with the flood, as he did. Past tense. Acknowledging the flood as a mistake, or at least as an act whose repetition is now excluded by covenant. The ancient astronaut interpretation reads this alongside Statement 7, in which Enki argues in the assembly that the flood cannot do what Enlil thinks it will do, because what was placed in the earth has become part of it. The covenant that concludes the flood narrative is not simply a moral commitment, it is a technical acknowledgement. The experiment cannot be reset by surface erasure. The Teimah persists. And so the covenant is not generosity. It is the Creator acknowledging, after the event, what Enki said before the event. The flood did not accomplish what was intended. The experiment survived. And the surviving experiment now exists under a condition of permanent preservation, not by divine mercy alone, but by the structural reality that Statement 4 describes. The image cannot be removed. The covenant is Statement 4, retranslated into the vocabulary of the Genesis tradition and placed at the end of the flood account as a conclusion. The Vedic parallel to the 12 statements is less direct but more architecturally complex, and ancient astronaut researchers have found it more useful for understanding the cosmological framework within which the statements operate rather than for confirming specific events. The Vedic tradition contains a creation mythology in which a divine being called Prajapati, the lord of creatures, creates the world and its inhabitants through a process of sacrifice and emanation. Prajapati is not a direct equivalent to Enki, but he shares several structural characteristics. He is the designer of the created world. He is deeply invested in the project of creation in ways that go beyond the instrumental. And in certain Vedic texts, particularly in the Shatapatha Brahmana, he is described as becoming exhausted by the act of creation, his life force depleted by what he has given to the world, and as having to be reconstituted by the beings he has created before he can be whole again. This is a remarkable parallel to Statement 6. Enki says to create is to be bound. The Vedic tradition expresses this binding through the image of a creator who has poured himself into the creation to the point of depletion. The creator is not separate from the created. He has become embedded in it. And his relationship to the created world is not one of sovereign distance but of mutual dependence. In the Shatapatha Brahmana account, the gods must reconstitute Prajapati through ritual. The ritual is the mechanism by which the creator is maintained in relation to the creation. Without the ritual, the creator would dissolve back into formlessness. With it, the creation and the creator sustain each other. The ancient astronaut interpretation reads this through the lens of Statement 12. The work binds the worker to the place of the work. In the Vedic parallel, the binding has a specific mechanism, the ritual, the ongoing ceremony that maintains the relationship between creator and creation, the mechanism that prevents the dissolution of the connection that creation produced. If you read the entire system of ancient religious ritual through this lens, something interesting happens. The ancient astronaut interpretation asks whether the ritual traditions that persisted across ancient civilizations, the temple ceremonies, the astronomical observances, the sacrificial rites, the liturgical cycles, were not primarily about human spiritual benefit, but about the maintenance of a connection. A technical connection. A connection that Enki's creation installed between the human community and whoever Enki belongs to, and that required regular maintenance to remain functional. The ritual as maintenance protocol, not metaphor, not psychology, a technical requirement built into the design of the creation, the mechanism by which the Teema, the divine image that was placed, remains oriented toward its origin, rather than dissipating into the noise of biological existence. This is speculative, and the ancient astronaut researchers who advance this interpretation are careful to note its speculative character. But it is not arbitrary speculation. It is speculation that follows directly from taking the 12 statements literally and asking what their implications would be for the institutional and ritual practices of the ancient world. If Statement 4 is literal, the divine image was placed physically. If Statement 5 is literal, the image orients the carrier toward the origin. If Statement 12 is literal, the ones who placed it are still here and still bound. Then the question of how the connection is maintained across the interval between the original installation and the present becomes a technical question with a technical answer. The Vedic parallel suggests the answer is ritual. The Hermetic parallel suggests the answer is philosophy. The Genesis parallel suggests the answer is covenant. The ancient astronaut interpretation says all three are pointing to the same thing, using the vocabularies available to their respective traditions. A maintenance protocol, a mechanism for keeping the connection active across the long interval between installation and completion. The ritual is the mechanism. The philosophy is the documentation. The covenant is the binding instrument. And all three, read through the lens of the 12 statements, are describing the same operational reality from different cultural angles. We are now in a period when the ritual has largely dissolved in the cultures that preserved it most faithfully, when the philosophy has been separated from its cosmological grounding and treated as abstract speculation, and when the covenant tradition has become a theological claim rather than a recognized description of an actual relationship. In the ancient astronaut interpretation, this is the phase that Statement 5 predicts. The looking up has reached a point where the origin is almost legible. The instruments are almost calibrated correctly. The reading of the 12 statements that we are doing right now is part of the recalibration. And somewhere in the process of that recalibration, the maintenance protocol that the ritual traditions preserved is being recreated in a new form, not as ceremony, as investigation, as the specific kind of looking up that produces not devotion but knowledge, not worship but understanding. The kind of understanding that Statement 12 says the work was placed here to produce. Ancient astronaut researchers disagree significantly about the nature of Enki's relationship to the broader Anunnaki project, And those disagreements are worth examining because they reveal where the interpretive limits of the available evidence lie. The first and most fundamental disagreement concerns Enki's motivation. Was Enki's consistent defense of the human being an expression of genuine concern for a created being he felt responsible for? Or was it the strategic positioning of a faction within the divine assembly whose interests were best served by preserving and developing the human population against the extermination preference of Enlil's faction? Sitchin's reading generally treats Enki as genuinely benevolent, a being who created the human being with care, who intervened to save it from the flood at personal risk, who placed the Apkallu as teachers to preserve civilizational knowledge, and whose 12 statements collectively express a coherent ethical position about the obligations of creators to created beings. In this reading, Statement 6, the binding of creator to creation, is not a strategic constraint but a moral commitment that Enki articulates and lives by. Other researchers, particularly those who are more suspicious of the Anunnaki agenda in general, argue that Enki's apparent benevolence is a function of his faction's interests, rather than a pure expression of concern for human welfare. In this reading, the disagreement between Enki and Enlil is not a disagreement between benevolence and malevolence, but a disagreement between two factions with different long-term strategies for managing the human population. Enlil wants to reset and simplify. Enki wants to preserve and develop. Both want to maintain control. The difference is tactical. This reading finds support in the Adapa story, which is not among the 12 statements, but is adjacent to them. Enki trains Adapa, the first sage, to be wise and capable. He brings Adapa before Anu, the highest authority. And then, when Anu offers Adapa the bread and water of immortality, Enki has already told Adapa to refuse them. In the mainstream reading, this is protective parenting, Enki knowing that what Anu offers might actually be harmful. In the suspicious reading, Enki is managing the human development ceiling. He creates a supremely capable human being, and then ensures that being does not achieve immortality, because an immortal human being with full wisdom and capability would be unmanageable. The 12 statements do not resolve this question. They do not tell us whether Enki is motivated by love or strategy. What they tell us is what Enki said, and what the consequences of those sayings have been for the human experiment. Statement 12 does not require Enki's benevolence to be true. The binding it describes is structural, not emotional. Whether Enki loves the creation or simply cannot disengage from it, the result is the same. They cannot leave. The work continues. The binding persists. The second major disagreement concerns the present state of the Anunnaki presence. Some researchers in the ancient astronaut tradition argue that the Anunnaki are not present on Earth's surface in any physical form during the current period. They departed, at some point after the last phase of direct engagement, to whatever home base they came from. Statement 12's binding means they cannot fully disengage from the experiment, but their engagement is now remote, indirect, expressed through information management, through the maintenance of whatever technology continues to interface with the human development process, through the institutions and traditions that carry the original knowledge forward in degraded but functional form. Other researchers argue the Anunnaki presence is still physically local, that there are operational sites on Earth that continue to function, underground facilities, perhaps in the deep cave systems of various continents, perhaps in underwater locations where the original Abzu operations were established. That the Apkallu tradition of amphibious or water-associated beings represents a real, ongoing presence in locations not accessible to ordinary human investigation. And that the contact accounts of the modern era, particularly the aquatic UFO phenomena documented by researchers like Ivan Sanderson, are evidence of physical presence rather than remote management. The 12 statements do not resolve this either. Statement 9 says Enki knows the Earth's interior. Statement 2 says he chose a physical seat. Neither statement tells us whether those operational locations are still in use or have been abandoned. The third disagreement concerns the timeline. How long do we have? If Statement 12 says the work is not finished, and the ones who placed it cannot leave until it is, the obvious follow-on question is when it finishes. What is the completion condition? And how close are we to it? Sitchin argued, controversially, that the Anunnaki timeline was linked to astronomical cycles, particularly to the precession of the equinoxes. The Great Year of 25,920 years produces specific astronomical configurations that the ancient traditions associated with world age transitions. The end of the Mayan calendar, the Vedic concept of yugas, the Hesiodic ages of the world, the Norse concept of the Fimbul winter before Ragnarok. All of these in Sitchin's framework, and in the frameworks of researchers who followed him, point to a cyclical astronomical timeline that the Anunnaki project is running on. In this reading, the current period is the transitional period between ages, the period when the looking up that Statement 5 predicts reaches its resolution, when the instruments are calibrated correctly, when the record that was preserved is finally read with enough context to be understood rather than just decoded, and when whatever the work was placed to become reaches the point of visibility. Other researchers reject the astronomical determinism, but share the sense that the current period is a critical juncture. The convergence of technological capability, the translation and distribution of the ancient texts, the emergence of serious scientific investigation into anomalous phenomena, and the increasing frequency of what researchers call high strangeness events, all point to a phase of the experiment that is different from the long, stable periods of human civilizational development. Whether this convergence means the work is close to its completion, or simply that the experiment is in a critical and volatile phase that could go in multiple directions, the 12 statements cannot say. What they can say, and what they do say through Statement 12, is that whatever phase we are in, it has not ended. The binding persists, the presence continues, and the work is still growing toward what it was placed to become. There is one aspect of the 12 statements that we have not yet examined, and it is the aspect that the most careful readers of the Sumerian tradition, including those who are not committed to any particular interpretive framework, find most difficult to dismiss. It is the literary structure. The Sumerian literary tradition, as it has been analyzed by scholars including Jeremy Black in Reading Sumerian Poetry, and by the editorial team of the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature at Oxford, is not a primitive tradition. It is one of the most formally sophisticated literary traditions known to us from the ancient world. Sumerian literary compositions use deliberate parallelism, chiastic structure, ring composition, numerical patterning, and intertextual reference in ways that require extensive literary training to produce and recognize. These are not oral improvisation traditions that were later written down. They are compositions that were designed to be written, that depend on the written form for their structural effects, and that reward the kind of sustained, close reading that only writing makes possible. The 12 statements, in the ancient astronaut reading, are being treated as a thematic cluster, a set of statements drawn from multiple texts in the Enki corpus that form a coherent argument when read together. But the ancient astronaut tradition did not invent this clustering. It was anticipated by Thorkild Jacobsen himself, who in his treatment of the Enki texts in Treasures of Darkness noted that Enki's theological profile is uniquely systematic among the Sumerian divine figures. While other deities are defined primarily by their domain, their power, and their relationship to specific ritual functions, Enki is defined by a set of principles that run consistently across all the texts associated with him. The consistency, Jacobsen noted, is not just thematic, it is argumentative. Enki's various appearances in the Sumerian literary corpus add up to a position, a stance toward the world, toward creation, toward the relationship between the divine and the human. Jacobsen read that position as a theological expression of the Sumerian worldview about wisdom, creativity, and the nature of the divine craftsman. The ancient astronaut reading says Jacobsen was right that the position is coherent and systematic, but wrong about what the coherence and systematism mean. A theological position about the nature of wisdom does not require the speaker to be consistent across multiple separately composed texts spanning centuries of literary production. A real position, held by a real entity with real commitments and a real operational relationship to the subject matter, does. The 12 statements are coherent in the way that a real person's position on a real issue is coherent, not in the way that a mythological abstraction is coherent. Mythology tolerates contradictions because contradictions are not a problem for symbolic systems. Real positions tolerate contradictions poorly, especially when the speaker has a technical understanding of the subject matter and is speaking on the record. Enki speaks on the record 12 times on the subject of the earth and the human being and the relationship between them. And the 12 statements do not contradict each other. They develop each other. Statement 1 establishes the relationship. Statement 2 establishes the operational reality. Statement 3 establishes the infrastructure. Statement 4 establishes the irreversibility. Statement 5 establishes the built-in orientation. Statement 6 establishes the creator's permanent responsibility. Statement 7 challenges the flood decision on technical grounds. Statement 8 establishes the necessity of preserved records for future retrieval. Statement 9 establishes the depth of the survey knowledge. Statement 10 establishes the technical sophistication regarding the mechanisms of fate. Statement 11 establishes the shared material origin of the human and the earth. Statement 12 establishes the permanent binding of creator to creation until the work reaches its completion. 12 statements, no contradictions, a complete argument. From a figure whose literary profile, according to the most eminent scholar of Sumerian religion in the 20th century, is uniquely systematic and argumentative among all the figures in the Sumerian tradition. The mainstream interpretation says this is because Enki represents a coherent set of cultural values that the Sumerian civilization chose to invest in a single mythological figure. The ancient astronaut interpretation says this is because Enki held a coherent set of operational views about a project he was personally involved in, and those views were recorded by the communities that observed him. Both explanations account for the systematic quality of the statements. One of them requires the existence of a being who actually held these views. The other does not. The ancient astronaut interpretation chooses the explanation that requires the being, because the explanation that does not require the being has to work too hard to account for specific things in the texts. The specific location of the seat, the specific warning about irreversibility in the assembly, the specific pronoun in Statement 8, the specific technical language in Statement 10, the specific claim in Statement 12 about the ongoing binding. Mythology explains things in general. These 12 statements explain things specifically. And specificity, the ancient astronaut tradition argues, is what distinguishes a report from a myth. The question of what to do with this conclusion, once you have arrived at it, is one that the ancient astronaut tradition handles differently from the way a mainstream scholarly tradition would handle a new finding. In mainstream scholarship, a new finding is submitted to peer review, tested against existing evidence, revised, and eventually incorporated into the existing framework, or rejected and explained away. The process is adversarial by design. The goal is to eliminate weak interpretations through rigorous challenge and preserve only what survives that challenge. The ancient astronaut tradition does not operate inside that framework, and this is both its strength and its vulnerability. The strength is that it is free to take seriously evidence that the mainstream framework has already excluded by definitional fiat. The vulnerability is that without the adversarial filter, weak interpretations can persist alongside strong ones without being clearly separated. When it comes to the 12 statements, the ancient astronaut tradition's strongest claim is also its simplest. Read these texts. Apply the same interpretive standards you would apply to any other ancient document. Do not decide in advance that the divine figures are mythological. Read what the texts say and ask whether it is more consistent with the mythological explanation or the literal one. The mythological explanation produces this summary. A culture projected its values about wisdom, water, creativity, and the relationship between humanity and the divine into a mythological figure called Enki. That figure's various appearances in the culture's literature express those values consistently because the culture was coherent in its understanding of what wisdom, water, and creative power mean. The consistent argumentative quality of Enki's statements across multiple texts is a product of the culture's theological coherence. The literal explanation produces this summary. A being with extensive knowledge of Earth's geology, biology, and astronomical situation established operational bases on this planet, undertook a genetic modification project on the local biological population, argued against catastrophic intervention in that project's results, preserved the project across catastrophic interruptions, and made a series of on-the-record statements about the permanent nature of the relationship between creator and creation. Those statements were preserved in the oldest writing on the planet by the communities that witnessed them, and they remain accessible today. You have to choose which summary is more consistent with what the texts actually say. You have to choose without being allowed to use as a deciding factor the prior assumption that divine beings are mythological and therefore the literal reading is impossible. If you remove that prior assumption and look only at the texts, the 12 statements make a stronger case for the literal reading than for the mythological one. Not because the mythological reading is incoherent, it is coherent on its own terms, but because the specific details in the 12 statements, the pronoun in Statement 8, the technical language in Statement 10, the irreversibility warning in Statement 4, the seat location in Statement 2, are more explicable as the record of a real entity with real operational knowledge than as the product of cultural theological projection. A culture projecting its values into a mythological figure does not typically give that figure specific locational coordinates, specific engineering warnings about irreversibility, specific technical vocabulary about mechanisms of fate, or specific first-person plural pronouns about future retrieval needs. Those details are not what mythology requires. Mythology requires grandeur and power and significance. It does not require operational specificity. The operational specificity in the 12 statements is what the ancient astronaut interpretation builds its case on. And it is the part of the case that the conventional reading has the hardest time explaining without falling back on the pre-commitment to mythological interpretation as the filter. This does not prove the ancient astronaut interpretation correct. Proof is not available at the current state of evidence. What is available is the assessment of which interpretation better fits the specific content of the texts. And on that specific assessment, the 12 statements are a stronger case for the ancient astronaut reading than the mainstream tradition typically acknowledges. Let us return to the structure of the 12 statements one more time, because the structure itself carries information that the content analysis alone does not fully reveal. The statements are distributed across Enki's appearances in the Sumerian literary corpus in a way that is not random. Statement 1 is from the earliest textual tradition, the earliest appearance of Enki as a distinct literary figure rather than a generic water deity. It establishes the foundational relationship between Enki and the earth. The earth recognized him. Mutual recognition. This is the starting point. Statements 2 and 3 are operational. They describe the physical infrastructure of the project. A seat, a reception site. These are the logistical realities that follow from the initial relationship. Statements 4 through 6 are about the creation of the human being and the consequences of that creation. The irreversibility, the built-in orientation, the creator's permanent responsibility. These are the technical and ethical framework of the project as it develops through its central act. Statements 7 and 8 are about the crisis, the flood debate, the attempt at erasure, the failure of that attempt, and the instruction to preserve the record for future retrieval. These are the crisis management phase of the project narrative. Statements 9 and 10 are about depth of knowledge, the geological survey, the technical understanding of the mechanisms of fate. These are revelations of capability that are not dramatic events but demonstrations of the level at which Enki understands the project he is involved in. Statements 11 and 12 are the conclusion. The human and the earth are made from the same material. The binding between creator and creation is permanent and persists until the work reaches its destination. This distribution is not an artifact of the ancient astronaut interpretation. It is the actual distribution of the texts in the Enki corpus, read in approximate chronological order of composition. The Enki tradition begins with the earth recognition statement. It develops through the operational and creation materials. It reaches its crisis in the flood tradition. It grounds itself in deep knowledge, and it concludes with the permanent binding statement. This is the shape of a complete argument, not a random collection of mythological fragments that happen to concern the same figure. A coherent narrative arc with a beginning, a development, a crisis, a grounding, and a conclusion. The conclusion is Statement 12. And the conclusion says the argument is not finished. The work continues. The binding persists. What the ancient astronaut interpretation adds to the literary analysis is the question of whether an argument, this coherent, spanning texts, composed across several centuries of Sumerian literary production, is better explained as a cultural theology or as a preserved record. And the answer it gives is the one we have been developing for the last 2 hours. The specificity, the operational vocabulary, the technical warnings, the specific pronouns, and the final statement about the permanent binding are more consistent with a preserved record than with a cultural theology. But there is a third possibility that neither the mainstream tradition nor the ancient astronaut interpretation adequately accounts for, and it is worth naming before we close. The third possibility is that the Sumerian scribal tradition was itself the first ancient astronaut research tradition, that the priests and scholars of Nippur and and Eridu were doing exactly what we are doing now, reading texts that had been passed down to them from an earlier period, texts whose full context they could no longer access, and trying to understand what those texts actually meant, building a theological and mythological framework, not because they were naive and pre-scientific, but because they were doing the best available interpretive work with texts whose original context was already several generations removed. The culture that produced the 12 statements may not have been Enki's culture. It may have been a human culture that received the statements from Enki's culture, preserved them in the best vocabulary available, and built a religious and literary tradition around them in the same way that we are building a research tradition around them now. If this is true, then the Sumerian mythology is not the opposite of what the ancient astronaut interpretation is doing. It is the first version of it. The Sumerians were the ancient astronaut researchers of 4,000 years ago, working with oral tradition and clay tablets instead of published books and documentary films, but working on the same problem. What do these statements mean? Who made them? What do they tell us about where we came from and why we are here and what is coming? The same problem. Different instruments, different vocabularies, the same looking up. Statement 5. The humans will look up. The image that was placed in them is the image that looks up. This cannot be prevented because it is in the design. The Sumerians looked up. Their descendants looked up through the Egyptian and Babylonian and Hebrew and Greek traditions. The medieval scholars looked up through the theological and alchemical traditions. The modern researchers look up through the ancient astronaut framework. And whatever comes next in the sequence will look up through whatever framework it has available. The looking up does not stop. It cannot stop. And the looking up, in every generation, produces the same basic question in the vocabulary of its era. What are we? Where did we come from? Why does the answer feel like it is up there rather than down here? And the 12 statements of Enki, read in whatever vocabulary you have access to, say the same thing in response to that question that they have always said. The answer is up there because that is where the material came from. And the material is still here. And the ones who placed it are still bound to it. And the work is not finished. And that is why they can never leave us alone. There are researchers who have spent their careers specifically on the question of what knowledge the Sumerian tradition actually preserved about the mechanics of the creation, and their findings are worth examining in some depth because they bear directly on how to interpret Statement 4 and Statement 11 together. The most relevant academic work in this area is not in the ancient astronaut tradition at all. It is in the archaeology of the Ubaid period, the cultural phase that immediately precedes the emergence of the full Sumerian civilization, and it concerns a set of figurines that were found primarily at sites in southern Mesopotamia, including Eridu, and Al-Ubaid itself. The Ubaid figurines are terracotta human-like figures. What makes them distinctive, and what has generated considerable scholarly discussion, is that they do not look fully human. Their heads are elongated, their eyes are large and almond-shaped, their faces are narrow. They are sometimes depicted with what appear to be scales, or a skin texture different from normal human representation. And most strikingly, some of the female figurines are shown nursing infants, and those infants share the same non-human physiognomy as the adults. The mainstream explanation for the Ubaid figurines places them in the tradition of apotropaic, or cult figurines that served ritual purposes related to fertility, protection, or ancestor veneration. The elongated heads are a deliberate stylistic choice, possibly indicating high status or divine connection. The scale-like texture may represent a specific garment or a tattooing tradition. The non-human appearance is artistic convention rather than a representation of literal physical reality. Ancient astronaut researchers have a different view, and it is worth presenting without caricature because the specific argument they make is more precise than the dismissive framing suggests. The argument is not simply that the Ubaid figurines are portraits of aliens. The argument is that the figurines appear at the earliest phase of settled agricultural civilization in Mesopotamia, at the very sites that the Sumerian tradition identifies as the locations of the first contact between the Anunnaki and the human population, and that their distinctive physical characteristics are consistent across multiple sites over a period of several hundred years. This consistency, the argument goes, is not the consistency of an arbitrary artistic convention. It is the consistency of a community representing something it actually saw. Communities do not represent things they have not seen in the same way they represent things they have seen. A conventional artistic tradition will produce variation. Individual artisans making stylized human figures for ritual purposes will produce variation in scale length, eye size, head proportion. The Ubaid figurines show a level of consistency that is more characteristic of representation than of convention. The artisans are all drawing from the same visual reference. Statement 3 says Enki prepared the earth as a reception site for those who come from above. Statement 1 says the earth recognized him when he arrived. If the beings who arrived had a specific physical appearance distinct from the local human population, then the communities that observed them would produce visual records of that appearance. And if those visual records were preserved in the context of the religious and institutional traditions that the arriving beings established, they would show the consistency that the Ubaid figurines show. This is not proof, it is pattern recognition. The pattern is this: distinctive non-human physical characteristics represented consistently across multiple sites at the cultural founding moment of the civilization that preserved the 12 statements. The ancient astronaut interpretation says the pattern is evidence. The mainstream interpretation says the pattern is coincidence and artistic convention. The texts do not resolve the question definitively, But the convergence of the physical evidence from the Ubaid period with the textual evidence in the 12 statements produces a cumulative case that is harder to dismiss than either strand of evidence is individually. The figurines look like something was there, the statements say something was there, and the city that produced the most distinctive versions of both the figurines and the textual tradition is Eridu, the city Enki chose as his seat in Statement 2. This is not the smoking gun the ancient astronaut tradition would like to have, but it is exactly the kind of convergent evidence that the research tradition has consistently found at the intersection of the physical and the textual record. Not proof, convergence. And convergence in a pattern that is more consistent with one interpretation than with the other. We have spent considerable time on the statements themselves and the evidence that surrounds them. Now we need to examine what the 12 statements collectively imply about the present, not as a matter of speculation, but as a matter of logical consequence. If Statement 4 is true, the divine image placed in the human being cannot be removed. It persists, it accumulates, it develops across generations. If Statement 5 is true, the divine image orients the carrier toward the origin. The looking up is built in, it cannot be prevented. If Statement 11 is true, the human being and the earth are made from the same material. The separation is smaller than it appears. And if Statement 12 is true, the ones who place the work here cannot leave until the work reaches what it was placed to become. Then the present situation of humanity is not random. It is not the product of blind, evolutionary, and historical forces alone. It is the product of a project with a specific origin, a specific design, and a specific endpoint. And that project is still active. The ones who started it are still present. The binding that Statement 12 describes is still operative. What does this mean for the specific situation we are in right now? The ancient astronaut interpretation answers this question differently depending on which strand of the tradition you are consulting. But there are some points of convergence that appear across almost all of the research tradition. The first convergence point is that the current period is not ordinary. The concentration of technological development, the recovery of the ancient records, the emergence of serious investigation into anomalous phenomena, and the specific quality of the looking up that is happening in the current generation all point to a phase of the experiment that is qualitatively different from the long stable periods of agricultural civilizational maintenance. The Sumerian king list records the long reigns of the post-flood kings as becoming progressively shorter. This is usually read as a narrative of human civilization, gradually replacing divine administration. But the ancient astronaut interpretation reads it as a description of the binding becoming progressively less direct. The Anunnaki administration of humanity in the period immediately after the flood was direct. It diminished to the level of the Apkallu, the sages who taught rather than ruled. It diminished further to the level of the priestly intermediary traditions. And eventually it became indirect enough that the mainstream academic tradition could argue it never existed at all. The progressively less direct binding is not a weakening of Statement 12. It is the experiment maturing. A less direct binding means a more autonomous created being. A more autonomous created being is one that is growing toward what it was placed to become. And the growth toward the completion is what Statement 12 says is the condition under which the binding eventually resolves. The second convergence point is that whatever the experiment is growing toward, it involves a specific kind of knowledge. Not just technological knowledge, though that is part of it. Not just self-knowledge, though that is also part of it. The specific knowledge that the 12 statements collectively describe as the destination of the looking up is the knowledge of origin, of what the human being is, of where it came from, of what the connection between itself and the earth and the sky and the ones who placed it here actually consists of. The experiment reaches its completion not when humanity achieves a particular technological level, not when it achieves a particular political or ethical level, but when the looking up that Statement 5 describes resolves into the understanding of origin that the entire 12-statement arc is building toward, when the human being understands what it is, where the material that was placed in it came from, why the earth feels like home in a way that runs deeper than mere biological habituation, and why the sky feels like origin, in a way that no rational explanation has ever fully satisfied. Statement 12 says, the work binds the worker until the work reaches what it was placed to become. If what the work was placed to become is the human being understanding its own origin, then the binding resolves not when humanity is destroyed or transcended or replaced, but when humanity knows itself fully enough that the Creator's responsibility toward the creation has been fulfilled. The Creator cannot leave until the creation knows what it is. This is the most human reading of Statement 12, and it is also the most theologically profound, not because it requires supernatural belief, but because it describes a relationship between creator and creation whose resolution depends on the creation's own achievement of self-knowledge. The creator is present, is bound, is unable to turn away, not as a jailer or a controller or a resource manager, but as a parent who cannot rest until the child knows who it is. Whether that metaphor accurately describes the nature of the relationship, whether Enki's motivation is that parental in character, is something the 12 statements do not settle. But the structure of the binding, as Statement 12 describes it, is most naturally read in these terms. The work reaches what it was placed to become when the creation achieves what was placed in it from the beginning. The knowledge that is in the design, the self-understanding that is implicit in the Ti'ima from its first installation. And that, in the ancient astronaut reading, is why the investigation into the 12 statements is not a detour from the main project of human self-understanding. It is the main project. Understanding what Enki said about this earth is part of understanding what we are, because what we are is described in what he said, statement by statement, across 4,000 years of preserved inscription. We are the work that was placed here. We are the thing that continues to grow toward what it was placed to become. And the looking up that brought us to these tablets, that brought us to these translations, that brought us to this investigation, is itself the design functioning. The image that was placed in us is the image that looks up. And the looking up in this moment has reached far enough that we are reading the record of who placed it. That is not an accident. Let us address the objections directly, because any serious investigation into the 12 statements needs to account for why the mainstream academic tradition rejects the ancient astronaut interpretation, and whether those rejections are decisive. The first and most common objection is methodological. The ancient astronaut interpretation mixes texts from different periods, different contexts, and different cultural traditions, and treats them as if they are parts of a single, coherent argument. The Atrahasis is a Babylonian text from the 2nd millennium BCE. The Enki and the World Order is a Sumerian text from the 3rd millennium BCE. The late Babylonian Marduk prophecy tradition is from the 1st millennium BCE. Treating statements from these different periods and contexts as parts of a single 12-statement argument is methodologically illegitimate. It imposes a coherence on the material that the material itself does not have. This is a real objection, and it deserves a real answer. The ancient astronaut interpretation's answer is that the objection proves too much. The mainstream tradition itself treats the Enki theological profile as coherent across multiple texts, multiple periods, and multiple cultural contexts. Jacobson's Treasures of Darkness does exactly what the objection accuses the ancient astronaut interpretation of doing. It assembles statements from multiple texts across multiple centuries and argues that they constitute a coherent portrait of the Enki figure's theological significance. If the method is illegitimate for the ancient astronaut reading, it is equally illegitimate for the mainstream reading. But the mainstream tradition does not apply the objection to itself. The ancient astronaut reading says this inconsistency reveals that the objection is not really methodological, it is substantive. The mainstream tradition is comfortable with the method when it produces mythological conclusions and uncomfortable when it produces literal conclusions. The objection to the method is an objection to the conclusion dressed as an objection to the approach. The second objection is evidential. The ancient astronaut interpretation relies heavily on absence of evidence arguments. Enki's knowledge of the Earth's interior is cited as evidence of a geological survey, but absence of evidence for a supernatural explanation is not evidence for a literal one. And the evidence that the ancient astronaut tradition does present, the Ubaid figurines, the king list numbers, the specific language of the texts, is all susceptible to alternative explanations. This is also a real objection, and the answer is also real. The ancient astronaut interpretation does not rely primarily on absence of evidence. It relies on the specific content of the statements themselves. The specific warning about irreversibility in the creation assembly is not an absence of evidence for an alternative. It is a specific detail that the mythological explanation struggles to account for. Why does a mythological representation of the principle of wisdom issue a warning about irreversibility in a divine assembly if the assembly and the creation are simply theological allegory? What does irreversibility mean in a purely theological framework, where everything is under divine control? The specific warning makes more sense in a literal reading, where Enki is a real entity issuing a real engineering caution to a real assembly about a real project. The specific pronoun in Statement 8 is not an absence of evidence. It is a specific grammatical choice that the mythological reading has to explain away. Why does Enki say we will need the record rather than they? The mythological reading has to assume a narrative voice shift or an imprecision in the composition. The literal reading does not have to assume anything. The pronoun says what it says. The third objection is the most fundamental and the most often cited. It is the objection from parsimony. The simplest explanation for the Sumerian texts is that they are mythology. They are stories that a culture told about its gods. To introduce ancient astronaut beings as the explanation for those stories is to multiply entities beyond necessity. Mythology is a sufficient explanation. Why add the complexity of actual beings? The ancient astronaut interpretation's answer is that parsimony is a tool for evaluating competing explanations of the same data. And the question is whether the mythological explanation actually is simpler than the literal one when applied to the specific data of the 12 statements. The mythological explanation has to explain why a cultural theology would produce the specific operational details in the 12 statements. It has to explain why the pronoun in Statement 8 is we. It has to explain why Statement 4 includes an engineering warning about irreversibility in the context of a divine assembly. It has to explain why Statement 2 specifies a physical seat rather than simply a domain. It has to explain why Statement 9 uses survey language rather than domain language. It has to explain why the entire 12-statement set forms a coherent operational narrative rather than a collection of theological attributes. To explain all of these specific details through the mythological lens, the explanation has to do a lot of work. It has to posit specific cultural, psychological mechanisms, specific scribal conventions, specific theological commitments that produce these specific details as outputs. That is not simple. That is complex. And the complexity is hidden by the generic label of mythology. The literal explanation, by contrast, requires one thing: that the beings described in the texts were real. If they were real, all 12 specific details fall out of the narrative without additional explanation. The pronoun is correct because the speaker is included in the pronoun. The engineering warning is genuine because the creation was a real engineering project. The survey language is accurate because the survey happened. The operational narrative coheres because it is describing real operations. One entity, one assumption, and everything follows. The ancient astronaut tradition argues that this is actually the more parsimonious explanation once you allow the initial assumption that the beings were real. The mainstream tradition does not allow that assumption. But that is a prior commitment, not a methodological conclusion. And prior commitments are not the same as evidence. The Enki corpus contains one more dimension that the 12 statements analysis does not fully capture. And it is worth spending time on because it concerns not what Enki said, but what Enki did not say. And the gaps in what was recorded are as significant as the content itself. The most conspicuous gap is in the account of the creation itself. The Atrahasis and Enki and Ninmah give us the logistics of the creation process, the biological material used, the procedure followed, the assembly convened, the various iterations of the created being before it reached its functional form. But neither text gives us what Enki specifically said to the first human beings he judged to be functionally adequate. There is a convention in Sumerian literary texts of the divine instruction at creation. When a divine being produces something new, there is typically a formal address to the new creation, a statement of its purpose, its status, its role in the cosmological order. Enlil addresses the grain after he creates it. Ninkasi addresses the beer. Enki himself addresses the rivers in Enki and the world order. The formal address is part of the creation act. But the formal address to the first adequate human being is missing from the surviving Atrahasis texts. The text goes from the successful creation to the aftermath, to the god's celebration, to the human beings beginning their labor, without the formal address. Scholars have attributed this to textual damage at the relevant passage. The Atrahasis tablets are not complete. There are lacunae, gaps where the clay has broken, or the inscription has become illegible. It is entirely possible that the formal address to the first human being was there, and has simply not survived in a legible copy. But the ancient astronaut interpretation notes the gap with specific interest, because what Enki would have said to the first fully functional human being is exactly the information that would have been most dangerous to preserve openly through the human scribal tradition. If the human beings were created for labor, the formal address would say that. And that is a statement that the human scribal tradition, which existed within and was maintained by the human community, might have had reasons to omit or quietly lose. Not through conspiracy, but through simple scribal discretion. A text that says to the first human being, "You were made to serve us," is not a text that a human scribal tradition would be highly motivated to copy faithfully across centuries of temple libraries. In the ancient astronaut reading, the gap in the Atrahasis at the formal address to the first human is not an accident of preservation. It is a preservation artifact. The most politically sensitive moment in the creation account, the moment when the purpose of the human being was stated directly to the human being, is the moment that is missing. What was said there? We do not know. The texts do not preserve it. The ancient astronaut tradition speculates variously. Sitchin's reading implies the address would have stated the labor assignment. The developmental reading implies it would have stated what the Te-Ema was placed to achieve. The benevolent reading implies it would have stated both, and that the labor assignment was always understood to be temporary and transitional. We do not know. We have Statement 11, which is Enki addressing later generations of human beings, not the first, and which says the human being and the earth are made from the same material. We have Statement 12, which says the work is not finished and the binding persists. But we do not have the first address, the founding statement of the human project from the perspective of its creator. The ancient astronaut interpretation treats this gap as the most significant silence in the entire ancient record. Because what was said to the first human being in the moment of successful creation is the thing from which everything else follows. It is the mission statement. It is the design brief. It is the statement of what the experiment was for. And it is missing. Or it was deliberately withheld from the form of the text that was transmitted through the human scribal tradition. Or it is the statement that Statement 8 refers to, the record that was preserved in a location where water and fire and time cannot reach it, waiting for retrieval by those who placed it and who will need it again. If Statement 8 is taken seriously, there is a record, preserved deliberately, designed to survive, located somewhere that the human scribal tradition could not easily access, containing the information that the human scribal tradition did not preserve, including, possibly, the formal address to the first human being. The founding statement of what the human experiment was placed here to become. The ancient astronaut interpretation does not know where that record is, but it knows, from Statement 8, that someone preserved it deliberately, and from Statement 12, that those who preserved it cannot leave and cannot turn away from here. They still have it. They still know what it says. And whatever the work was placed to become, the moment of completion may be partly defined by the moment when that record becomes accessible to the beings it concerns. The beings who were in the room when the first human being was addressed. The beings who heard what was said to them in that moment. The beings whose descendants have been looking up ever since, oriented by the image that was placed in them toward an origin they have never quite been able to see clearly. The first address is still out there. The people who gave it are still here, and the work has not yet reached what it was placed to become. But we are closer now than we were when the tablets were buried, and we are reading them. The astronomical dimension of the 12 statements has been touched on in the context of the Sitchin framework, but it deserves a more detailed examination because the astronomical knowledge embedded in the Sumerian tradition is one of the most difficult things for the conventional explanation to account for. The Sumerians had a sophisticated astronomical observation tradition. This is not disputed. They tracked the movements of the planets, recorded eclipses, developed a sexagesimal numbering system that is the origin of our 60-second minute and 60-minute hour, and produced astronomical tables that were accurate enough to be used for predictive purposes. The Babylonian astronomical tradition that developed from the Sumerian foundation eventually produced the kind of precise, predictive astronomy that allowed the computation of eclipses and planetary positions centuries in advance. What is disputed is how the Sumerians acquired this knowledge so early in the development of a settled agricultural civilization. The level of astronomical sophistication in the earliest Sumerian records, combined with the depth of accumulated observation that would be required to produce it, presents a timeline problem. The observations needed to produce the predictive accuracy visible in the Babylonian tradition require centuries of systematic record-keeping. The earliest Sumerian records appear at a level of sophistication that does not match what would be expected from a community that had only recently developed writing and settled agriculture. The ancient astronaut interpretation's answer to this timeline problem follows directly from Statement 8. The record was preserved. The astronomical observations were not developed from scratch by the early Sumerian communities. They were transmitted to those communities by the Apkallu, the 7 sages, who in the tradition are described specifically as bringing all knowledge of the arts and sciences to humanity. The Apkallu are the transmission mechanism by which a pre-existing astronomical knowledge base was deposited in the early human communities. If the Anunnaki project, in the ancient astronaut reading, included the construction of astronomical observation infrastructure during the pre-flood period, the period of the 8 kings and the 241,000-year administrative phase, then the astronomical database that the Apkallu transmitted to post-flood humanity was not new. It was archived. The observations had been made. The records had been kept. and the Apkallu carried those records across the flood catastrophe and deposited them in the earliest scribal traditions of the post-flood communities. This would explain why the earliest Sumerian astronomical records appear at a level of sophistication that does not match their chronological position in the development of the civilization. They are not the product of the early Sumerian civilization's astronomical program. They are the inheritance of a much older observation tradition, transmitted through the mechanism that Statement 8 describes, preserved specifically because we will need it. The specific astronomical knowledge that ancient astronaut researchers find most significant in this context is the knowledge of precession. The precession of the equinoxes is a slow wobble in the Earth's rotational axis that causes the position of the Sun at the vernal equinox to move through the zodiacal constellations over a period of approximately 25,920 years. The entire cycle is called the Great Year, or the Platonic Year. It takes roughly 2,160 years for the equinox to move through one zodiacal constellation, which the ancient world called an age. Knowledge of precession requires either a very long systematic observation program, spanning generations of careful astronomers tracking the slow shift of the stellar backdrop against the equinoctial sunrise, or a record of those observations made by someone who had access to a longer baseline of data than any single human civilization could accumulate. The ancient astronaut tradition, including Hancock's analysis in Fingerprints of the Gods and the work of astronomical archaeologists like Robert Schoch and John Anthony West on the stellar orientation of ancient Egyptian monuments, argues that knowledge of precession was embedded in the architectural alignments and mythological cycles of the earliest civilizations, not because those civilizations had time to develop it independently, but because it was transmitted to them from a source that had access to the full observational baseline. Statement 9 says Enki surveyed the earth and knows it as a craftsman knows his work site. An entity conducting a full geological and astronomical survey of a planet would, as a matter of course, have precise astronomical data including precession. The astronomical knowledge embedded in the Sumerian tradition, in the Egyptian tradition, in the Vedic tradition, in the Mesoamerican tradition, is consistent with a common transmission from a source that had this data. The alternative explanation is that each civilization developed its precessional knowledge independently. The ancient astronaut interpretation says this is not impossible, but it is improbable in the specific form the knowledge takes. Independent development would produce different starting points, different units, different mythological frameworks for encoding the data. What we actually find is that the mythological frameworks for encoding precessional knowledge in widely separated civilizations share specific structural characteristics that are more consistent with a common origin than with independent development. Hamlet's Mill, the landmark work by Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Dechend, documents the specific structural parallels in precessional mythology across multiple independent traditions in exhaustive detail. De Santillana and von Dechend were not ancient astronaut theorists. They were a historian of science and a historian of mythology, and their argument was that the precessional knowledge encoded in world mythology was older than any civilization currently known and was transmitted through a tradition whose origin they could not identify. The ancient astronaut interpretation identifies the origin. It is the source that Statement 8 says preserve the record for future retrieval. The astronomical data was part of what was preserved, and the transmission through the Apkallu was the mechanism by which the precessional knowledge ended up encoded in the mythological traditions of the world's earliest civilizations. We now need to address the Enoch tradition, because the Book of Enoch, which is a text from the Second Temple Jewish tradition, composed sometime between the 4th and 1st centuries BCE, contains material that is directly relevant to the 12 statements and that the ancient astronaut research tradition has found extremely significant. The Book of Enoch was not included in the canonical Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament canon, with the exception of a brief quotation in the letter of Jude. It was preserved primarily by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and it was rediscovered by the European scholarly tradition in the 18th century when James Bruce brought copies back from Ethiopia. Its relevance to the ancient astronaut research tradition was not widely recognized until the 20th century, when researchers including Sitchin and later Peter Horobin and others began examining its content in relation to the Sumerian materials. The Book of Enoch contains an account of beings it calls the Watchers, divine beings who descended to Earth and who interacted with the human population. The account parallels the Genesis chapter 6 passage about the sons of God, but provides much more detail. In the Enoch tradition, the Watchers teach humanity specific knowledge: astronomy, metallurgy, the crafting of weapons and jewelry, herbalism, divination, The specific knowledge sets that the Watchers transmit are the same knowledge sets that the Apkallu transmit in the Sumerian tradition. The ancient astronaut interpretation treats the Watchers and the Apkallu as parallel accounts of the same beings viewed from different cultural positions. The Sumerian tradition treats the transmission of knowledge as a divinely mandated civilizational gift. The Enoch tradition treats it as a transgression, as the Watchers violating boundaries they were not supposed to cross and giving humanity knowledge it was not supposed to have. Same events, different valence, different theological framing. But the Book of Enoch contains something that has no direct parallel in the Sumerian texts, and it is something that sits in direct relation to Statement 12. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers who descended and who interacted with the human population are eventually bound. Not in the sense of Statement 12's relational binding, in the sense of imprisonment. The divine authority, the equivalent of the Sumerian assembly, sentences the transgressing Watchers to confinement. They are bound in a place beneath the earth, beneath the mountains, awaiting judgment at the end of the age. The ancient astronaut interpretation finds this parallel to Statement 12's binding deeply significant, though it reads the two accounts as describing the same condition from opposite sides. Statement 12 says the binding is structural. It is a consequence of the creative act. The ones who place the work here cannot leave, because the work is not finished. And to leave unfinished work is to violate the most fundamental principle of the Creator's relationship to the creation. The Enoch tradition says the binding is punitive. The Watchers are imprisoned because they transgressed. They should not have descended. They should not have taught. They should not have interacted with the human population in the ways they did. And their confinement is the consequence of having done what they should not have done. The ancient astronaut interpretation asks whether these are two different events or two different framings of the same event. Did the Enki faction of the Anunnaki project, the faction that created the human being, defended it against the flood, transmitted knowledge through the Apkallu, and established the ongoing binding of Statement 12, receive a judgment from the higher authority, from the Anu level of the assembly, that what they did was a transgression? Was the binding that Statement 12 describes also understood within the Anunnaki hierarchy as a consequence, as a binding that was both natural and imposed? If so, the 12 statements and the Enoch Watcher account are not just parallel traditions. They are complementary perspectives on the same situation. Enki saying the binding is structural and permanent because the creation acts create binding, and the Enoch tradition saying the binding is also punitive because the creation acts transgressed limits that the higher authority had set. Both can be true simultaneously. The binding is permanent because it is structural. It is also permanent because it is a sentence. The creators of the human being are here, unable to leave, because the creation of the human being was both an act of genuine commitment and an act of transgression, from the perspective of the authority above the assembly. This reading of the 12 statements in relation to the Enoch tradition is not common in the ancient astronaut research literature because it requires holding two framings simultaneously rather than choosing one. But it is the reading that produces the most coherent synthesis of the available evidence. The binding is real, it is permanent, it follows from the creative act, and it is not entirely comfortable for those who are bound by it. This is consistent with the ambivalence that runs through the 12 statements themselves. Statement 4 is a warning. Statement 6 produces a silence. Statement 7 is an argument that fails. Statement 8 is the instruction to preserve a record for future use in an unspecified future that the speaker is still moving toward. These are not the statements of an entity that is entirely at peace with its relationship to the work it has placed here. They are the statements of an entity that is deeply invested in that work, fully aware of the permanent nature of the investment, and navigating the consequences of decisions that were both necessary and consequential in ways that were not fully predictable at the time they were made. In this reading, the ones who cannot leave us alone are not our conquerors or our puppeteers or our resource managers. They are the architects of a project that became more than it was designed to be, bound to that project by their own act of creation, waiting, as we are waiting, to discover what the work was placed to become. There is a reading of the 12 statements that synthesizes the mainstream academic position and the ancient astronaut interpretation, and while it is not widely held in either community, it deserves serious consideration because it takes both sets of evidence seriously without requiring the reader to fully commit to either framework. This synthetic reading begins with the acknowledgement that the Sumerian scribal tradition was sophisticated enough to preserve complex and specific information accurately over very long periods. The cuneiform writing system was designed specifically for precision. Scribal education in the temple schools of Nippur and Ur was rigorous and conservative. The texts that were copied faithfully because copying errors were understood as religious and administrative failures. The scribal tradition was not a telephone game that corrupted information through transmission. It was a deliberate and well-maintained archival system. Given this, the 12 statements should be taken as accurate representations of what was originally said or thought at whatever level of the tradition they originated from, not as later interpolations or deliberate theological constructions. As faithful preservations of material that was considered important enough to copy carefully across generations. The synthetic reading then asks what level of origination is most consistent with the specific content of the 12 statements. The simplest possibility is that the statements originated at the level of the Sumerian religious and literary tradition itself, as theological propositions developed by the temple scholars to articulate the culture's understanding of Enki's significance. In this reading, the scholars were brilliant and their theology was coherent, and the 12 statements represent the best human thinking available about the nature of wisdom, water, creation, and the divine-human relationship. The next possibility is that the statements originated at a level before the historical Sumerian civilization, in an earlier tradition that the Sumerians inherited and preserved, a tradition belonging to the pre-flood period that the king list records, whatever that period actually was. In this reading, the statements are older than the Sumerian civilization that preserved them, and they carry information about that earlier period that the later scribal tradition no longer had full context to interpret. The most radical possibility is the ancient astronaut reading, in which the statements originate with an actual being who actually said these things about an actual project in actual circumstances that the Sumerian tradition preserved in mythological vocabulary without fully understanding what it was. Preserving. The synthetic reading says all three possibilities are partially true, and that the evidence does not definitively choose between them. The statements are coherent at the level of Sumerian theology. They are consistent with a pre-Sumerian tradition, and they contain specific operational details that are more easily explicable if they originated with a real entity than if they were theological constructions. What the synthetic reading holds is that the distinction between mythology and history may not be the right frame for evaluating the 12 statements. A more productive frame is the question of depth. How deep does the information in these statements go? Is it the surface layer of cultural theology? Or does it reach back to something older, something that the theological layer was built on, and that the theological layer preserves even as it transforms? The ancient astronaut tradition says the depth goes all the way to the origin, that the theological layer preserves the operational record because the operational record was the foundation. The mythology is the human translation of something that was not originally human. The synthetic reading says we cannot definitively confirm this, but we also cannot definitively exclude it. And the appropriate response to genuine uncertainty is not to choose the simpler explanation by default, but to hold the question open and continue gathering evidence. The 12 statements are what you read while you are holding the question open. They are the primary evidence. And the primary evidence, read on its own terms, without the prior commitment to mythological interpretation, is more consistent with the ancient astronaut reading than with the purely theological one. That is the conclusion of the synthetic analysis. Not a certainty, a weight of evidence assessment. And the weight goes to the interpretation that treats Enki as a real entity, that treats the 12 statements as a real record, and that treats Statement 12 as a real description of an ongoing condition. The binding persists, the work is not finished, and whatever the synthesis of the evidence ultimately produces, the 12 statements will be part of the record of the moment when the looking up reached this specific point of resolution. We are in the record. The investigation is part of what was recorded as going to happen. The reading of the 12 statements is itself one of the things that Statement 12 describes. The work growing toward what it was placed to become. The Mesoamerican traditions deserve a focused treatment in relation to the 12 statements because they represent the most geographically distant parallel to the Sumerian record and therefore the most powerful evidence for the ancient place. Astronaut claimed that the knowledge was transmitted globally, rather than developed independently. The Mayan tradition centers on a creator figure whose characteristics overlap significantly with Enki's. In the Popol Vuh, the Quiché Maya creation text, the creation of human beings goes through multiple iterations. The first humans are made from mud and fail. The second are made from wood and fail. The third, the ones who succeed, are made from corn, from the material of the earth itself. But they are given capacity by the divine creators, and specifically by a pair of divine beings called Tepeu and Gukumats, whose deliberation about the creation parallels the Sumerian assembly debate. The parallel that ancient astronaut researchers find most significant is the deliberate reduction of human capacity that occurs in the Popol Vuh after the third creation succeeds too well. The first-born humans are described as possessing full divine vision. They can see everything, know everything, understand everything. And the creators, worried that beings this capable will not serve the functions assigned to them, deliberately limit their vision. They cloud it. The beings who were made with full knowledge are reduced to partial knowledge, so that they remain within the parameters of their assigned role. This is the Adapa pattern. The human being is given capability. The capability is then managed, limited, or redirected. The Adapa story uses the mechanism of refusing the bread and water of immortality. The Popol Vuh uses the mechanism of divine intervention to cloud the vision. The structure is the same. The function is the same. The human being's development is managed at the ceiling. If these two traditions are preserving the same original event through independent cultural transmission, the event is the deliberate limitation of human cognitive capacity after the creation produced beings that were more capable than the project originally required. And the entity most closely associated with the ceiling management in the Sumerian tradition is Enki, specifically in the Adapa account. Ancient astronaut researchers, including Tellinger and the author Peter Moon, have argued that the deliberate reduction of human cognitive capacity is one of the most significant events in the history of the experiment, and that its traces are visible in the human genome. The human brain, they argue, uses a fraction of the capacity that its structure would appear to allow. The non-coding regions of the genome that were once called junk DNA may include sequences that code for capabilities that are present but not expressed, suppressed by mechanisms that are built into the biological architecture. This is highly speculative, and the ancient astronaut tradition that makes this argument does not have genetic evidence to support it directly. What it has is the convergence of the Popol Vuh limitation account and the Adapa management account, both describing the same structural intervention in human development, at the critical moment when the experiment produced beings that exceeded the original specification. Statement 11 says the human being and the Earth are made from the same material. If this is true at a biological level, if the te'ima that was placed in the human being carries the full capacities of whatever biological system it came from, then those capacities are present in the human biological structure. They were placed there at the creation. They cannot be removed, as Statement 4 says, but they can be suppressed. They can be managed. They can be expressed only partially, in the form that makes the human being functional within the parameters of the assigned developmental phase. And the ancient astronaut interpretation says the suppression mechanism is not permanent. It is developmental. It is appropriate to the current phase of the experiment, and as the experiment grows toward what it was placed to become, the suppression diminishes. The capacities that were placed in the creation at the beginning are expressed more fully as the creation matures into what the Creator designed it to eventually become. This is the most hopeful reading of the 12 statements, and it is also the most demanding, because if the capacities are there, and if the experiment is maturing into them, then the responsibility that comes with that maturation is the same responsibility that Statement 6 describes at the level of the Creator. To become what was designed is to take on the responsibility that the design entails. And whatever the design entails, Statement 12 says it will not be finished until it reaches completion. We have not reached completion, but we are further along than we were when the tablets were written. And the writing of the tablets was part of how we got here. And the reading of the tablets is part of how we will get where we are going. Statement by statement, 12 of them, across 4,000 years of preserved inscription, in the oldest writing on the planet, left for us by someone who said we would need it. Let us now examine what the 12 statements together produce as a theory of ongoing presence. Because the most practical implication of the 12 statements, the one that has the most direct bearing on how we understand what is happening in the world right now, is not the historical claim about what Enki did 4,000 years ago, but the present tense claim that Statement 12 makes about the current condition. The binding persists. The ones who placed it here cannot leave. The work continues to grow. If this is true, then there is an ongoing presence that is not human, that has been associated with this planet since before the beginning of what we call recorded history, and that is still here in whatever form the current phase of its relationship to the experiment takes. The ancient astronaut research tradition has spent considerable energy cataloging the evidence for ongoing non-human presence in the post-ancient period. The evidence ranges from architectural anomalies, structures whose construction methods remain unexplained even with full access to modern engineering knowledge, to the extensive written records of aerial phenomena across all periods of documented history, to the concentration of well-documented, technologically credible encounter accounts in the 20th and 21st centuries. The architectural evidence that is most relevant to the Enki tradition specifically is found in the underwater structures. In the past several decades, sonar mapping and underwater archaeological research have documented structures on the ocean floor in various parts of the world, including formations off the coast of Japan near Yonaguni, formations in the Persian Gulf, formations in the western Atlantic near the Bimini Archipelago, and formations in the Mediterranean. The interpretive status of these structures is contested. Some are definitively identified as natural geological formations. Others remain in genuine dispute between the geological and archaeological research communities. The ancient astronaut interpretation notes that the Persian Gulf structures are directly relevant to the Enki tradition because the Persian Gulf was, in the period of the Anunnaki project as described in the Sumerian texts, the body of water most closely associated with Enki's operational base. Eridu sat at the edge of the ancient Gulf. The Abzu tradition places Enki's primary location at the interface between freshwater and saltwater. And the flooding of the Gulf at the end of the last glacial maximum, roughly 8,000 years ago, would have submerged whatever infrastructure existed in the lower Gulf region at that time, under between 40 and 100 meters of water, depending on the specific location. The ancient astronaut interpretation of the Persian Gulf flooding is that it is what the Sumerian flood tradition is actually describing, not a global ocean flood, but the catastrophic flooding of the Persian Gulf basin at the end of the Ice Age, which would have destroyed the earliest operational sites along the Gulf margins and forced the relocation of the surviving populations and their knowledge to higher ground. The cities of the Sumerian civilization that appear in the archaeological record in the 5th and 4th millennia BCE are the result of that relocation. And the flood narrative in the Atrahasis is the cultural memory of the catastrophe that necessitated it. If this reading of the flood is correct, and researchers including the archaeologist Jeffrey Rose have argued for something close to it on purely archaeological grounds without the ancient astronaut framing, then the location of the earliest Anunnaki operational infrastructure is underwater in the Persian Gulf. And whatever structures are down there are what Statement 8's preserved record is physically associated with. The record that was placed where water cannot reach it, fire cannot reach it, and time cannot dissolve it, may be in a location that is currently underwater, but that was accessible during the pre-flood operational phase. The ancient astronaut interpretation does not claim to know specifically where the preserved record is. What it claims is that Statement 8 says it exists, that its location was chosen deliberately to survive what Enki knew was coming, and that the beings who placed it there are still here, still bound, and still know where it is. The ongoing presence is not, in this reading, the mystery at the center of the alien contact tradition. It is the expected consequence of Statement 12. Of course, they are still here. The binding has not dissolved, the work has not finished, and wherever they are, they still have access to what was placed for future retrieval, including the founding address to the first human being that the Atrahasis does not preserve. The ancient astronaut research tradition, at its best, is not claiming that alien beings are flying around in spaceships controlling human civilization. It is claiming something more specific and more verifiable. That the oldest written records on Earth describe a coherent operational history. That the entity at the center of that history made 12 statements about the Earth and the human being. That those 12 statements form a coherent argument about the permanent binding between creator and creation, and that the final statement in that argument, the 12th, says the binding has not been dissolved and the ones who place the work here cannot leave. This is either mythology or it is a report. The evidence we have examined over the course of this investigation is more consistent with the report reading than with the mythology reading. Not conclusively, but substantially. And if it is a report, then the implication is simple. They are still here. They have always been here. They cannot leave. And the work is not finished. Which means we are not finished either. The final section of this investigation needs to address what the 12 statements mean for the individual person who is reading them, not as a matter of cosmic significance, but as a matter of personal orientation. The ancient astronaut tradition has sometimes been criticized for producing a framework that is intellectually interesting but existentially passive. If we were created by advanced beings, if we are being managed by an ongoing presence that we cannot fully perceive or interact with, if the trajectory of human development is in some sense already determined by the parameters of the experiment, then what is the individual human being supposed to do with that? Statement 5 provides part of the answer. The image that was placed in the human being is the image that looks up. The looking up is not passive. It is oriented. It has a direction. And the direction is not submission but investigation. The design produced beings who will find the origin. Finding the origin requires active engagement with the evidence. It requires exactly the kind of sustained attention that you are practicing by following this investigation to its conclusion. The looking up is the work. The investigation is the design functioning. Statement 5 does not say the humans will be told the origin. It says they will find it. Finding is active. Finding requires the exercise of exactly the capacities that Statement 11 says were placed in the human being from the beginning. The capacity to see relationships, to hold complex information in relation to other complex information, to ask why the details matter, and to follow the implications of specific language rather than accepting the generic interpretation. Statement 6 provides the second part of the answer. The binding cuts both ways. Enki is bound to his creation. But the creation, which carries the Tei Ma, the divine image, which shares material origin with the earth, which has been developing toward the completion that Statement 12 describes, is not simply the passive object of that binding. In the fullest reading of the 12 statements, the creation is itself a party to the relationship, not an equal party in the current developmental phase, but a party whose increasing capacity brings it progressively closer to the position of agency that the design always pointed toward. The looking up is an exercise of agency. The reading of the tablets is an exercise of the capacity that was placed. The investigation into what Enki said is the design moving toward its completion. And each person who follows this investigation to its conclusion, who reads the 12 statements and asks whether they are mythology or a report, who sits with the specific details of the operational vocabulary and the specific pronoun in Statement 8 and the specific warning in Statement 4, is doing exactly what Statement 5 says the design produces. The looking up has reached a point where the looking up can read the record of why the looking up is built in. This is not a small thing. It is, in the ancient astronaut reading, the most significant moment in the history of the experiment. Not because it proves the 12 statements, not because it definitively resolves the mythology versus report debate, but because the very existence of this investigation, the fact that we now have the tablets translated, the genome sequenced, the anomalies documented, the astronomical knowledge recovered, and the awareness that the oldest writing on Earth is describing something more specific than cultural theology, means that the work has reached a point of development that was described in the design from the beginning. Statement 12 says, the work is not finished, but the work continuing to grow toward what it was placed to become means that each stage of the growth is part of the completion. We are not at the end, but we are further along than any previous generation. And the measure of how far along we are is not technological. It is the quality of the looking up. It is the specificity of the questions we are able to ask. It is the degree to which we can read the 12 statements and recognize them as a coherent argument addressed to us. The ancient astronaut interpretation ends, at its most honest, with an open question, not a dramatic revelation, not a final answer. An open question that is sharper and better formed than it was when the investigation began. What was the work placed to become? We do not know, Enki did not say. The formal address to the first human being is missing. The record that was preserved for future retrieval has not been recovered. The binding persists and the work continues. But the question is in focus now in a way it was not before. And a question in focus is closer to its answer than a question in blur. The 12 statements put the question in focus. They tell us what was placed, why it cannot be removed, why the ones who placed it cannot leave, and that the work is still growing toward its destination. They do not tell us what the destination is. That may be because the destination is not predetermined in the way the 12 statements are sometimes read. It may be that the work reaches what it was placed to become through the choices made by the beings who carry the image that was placed in them, through the looking up, through the investigation, through the accumulated choices of a species that carries both earth material and divine image in the same body, and that is in the process of figuring out what it means to be exactly that. If that is true, then Statement 12 is not a statement about fate, it is a statement about relationship, about a connection that persists not because it is forced, but because it was made with material that cannot simply disengage from its origin. The image that was placed looks up. The creator is bound to what was created, and the meeting toward which both are moving, the work reaching what it was placed to become, is a meeting that neither side can fully reach alone. That is the reading that does the most justice to all 12 statements. And it is the reading that makes the investigation not just intellectually necessary, but personally urgent. Because the work that is not finished is us. There is a final dimension of the 12 statements that has not yet been addressed, and it concerns the relationship between Enki and time. In the Sumerian cosmological tradition, time is not linear in the way that the modern scientific worldview conceives it. Time in the Sumerian framework is cyclical, organized around the great cycles of the heavens. The annual agricultural cycle, the longer precessional cycle, and the vast cycles of creation and destruction that produce the world ages the king list implicitly references. Within this cyclical framework, the past is not gone. It is a phase of the cycle that will return. The future is not unknown. It is a phase of the cycle that is coming. Enki, as the entity who understands the mechanisms of fate in Statement 10, operates within this cyclical framework with an understanding that the others in the assembly do not fully share. When he argues in Statement 7 that the flood cannot do what Enlil wants it to do, he is not just making a technical argument about the persistence of the Te-Ma. He is making a cyclical argument. The cycle that produced the human being will produce it again if it is destroyed. The experiment is built into the structure of the cycle. Destroying the current instantiation does not eliminate the experiment. It just resets the cycle. This is why Enlil's repeated attempts to reduce the human population through plague, famine, and eventually flood all fail. Not just because of Enki's circumventions, though those are the immediate mechanism, but because the cycle that produced the experiment is not something that a single decision by a single faction of the assembly can interrupt. The experiment is running on the cycle, and the cycle runs on. Statement 12, read through the cyclical framework, says something additional to what the linear reading produces. The work is not finished does not just mean the experiment has not reached its endpoint in a linear developmental sequence. It means the cycle that contains the experiment has not completed its rotation. The work reaches what it was placed to become when the cycle returns to the point from which it began. When the circle closes. The precessional great year of 25,920 years is the cycle most closely associated in the ancient astronomical traditions with the world age structure. If the Anunnaki project began at a specific point in the precessional cycle, its completion would be associated with the return to that point, the point where the cycle closes, the point where what was placed at the beginning of the rotation encounters itself again at the end. The ancient astronaut tradition that engages with the precessional framework places the current moment at a specific point in the great year, the transition between ages, the shift from one zodiacal era to the next. This is the moment that every ancient tradition that encoded precessional knowledge associated with transformation. With the end of one phase and the beginning of another. With the completion of something that had been building across the entire preceding age. If the 12 statements are read in this precessional context, Statement 12 is not just describing an ongoing condition. It is describing a timing. The work is not finished. The cycle has not returned to its origin. But the cycle is moving toward that return. And the acceleration of the looking up, the recovery of the records, the emergence of the investigation, the convergence of the evidence, are all consistent with a position in the cycle that is close to the closing of the circle. Not finished, but close. This is the reading that the precessional dimension of the 12 statements produces. And it is the reading that makes the most sense of the specific convergence of evidence that the ancient astronaut tradition is encountering in the current period. The tablets were always there, buried under the mounds of southern Iraq, waiting for excavation. The genome was always there, present in the biology of every living human being, waiting for sequencing. The astronomical knowledge was always there, encoded in the mythological traditions of the world's civilizations, waiting for de Santillana and von de Chen to recognize its structure. All of it was always there, and all of it has become accessible in the same period, not because of any single discovery or any individual researcher's insight, because the cycle has moved to the point where the looking up that Statement 5 describes has reached the level of precision and the level of accumulated knowledge that allows the reading of the record to begin in earnest. We are reading the record. We are reading it now. And the reading is itself part of what the cycle was building toward. Statement 12 says the work is not finished. But we are reading, and the reading is the work. We have now worked through the full scope of the 12 statements, their context, their evidence, their implications, and their relationship to the parallel traditions that corroborate them. What remains is the closing, not the final answer. There is no final answer in an investigation of this kind, and any researcher or documentary that offers you one is not telling you the truth. The evidence does not produce certainty. It produces weight, and the weight has been assessed as carefully as the available material allows. The weight falls on the side of a report. 12 statements, one entity, one subject, 4,000 years of preserved inscription, specific operational vocabulary, specific pronouns, specific engineering warnings, a coherent arc from arrival to permanent binding, a final statement that says the binding has not dissolved and the work is still ongoing. If this is mythology, it is mythology unlike anything else in the ancient world in its combination of operational specificity and systematic coherence across multiple texts and multiple periods. The mainstream tradition says it is mythology. The ancient astronaut tradition says it is a report. The synthetic reading says it is a preserved record of something that actually happened, interpreted in mythological vocabulary because that was the vocabulary available. All three readings agree on one thing. The 12 statements matter. They are not peripheral to the Sumerian tradition. They are central to it. They describe the most significant relationship in the cosmological system, the relationship between the creator and the creation, the relationship between the divine and the human, the relationship between the earth and whatever exists beyond it. And the 12th statement says that relationship is not over. We are in it. We have always been in it. The looking up is built into us. The origin is encoded in the material that was placed in the clay. The earth carries the experiment. The creators carry the binding. And the cycle moves toward the point where the circle closes and the work reaches what it was placed to become. This is the most ancient account of who we are that we have access to. It is older than the Bible, older than the Vedas, older than the Egyptian texts, older than the Hermetic tradition. It comes from the first cities, the first writing, the first communities that chose to record what they knew in a medium that would last. They recorded the 12 statements because the statements were important enough to record, because the entity who made them was real enough to be documented, because the relationship the statements describe was understood to be permanent and ongoing and worth preserving in the most durable medium available. Clay tablets last 4,000 years. The tablets survived, the statements survived. And now, in this specific moment of the precessional cycle, when the looking up has reached the precision that allows us to read them and recognize their structure, we have access to the oldest account of our own origin that exists on this planet. Use it, not as dogma, not as a replacement for the investigation, as a starting point, as the oldest map of the territory we are still exploring, as the record that was left for us by someone who said, in Statement 8, that we would need it. We needed it. We found it. We are reading it. The work is not finished, but neither are we. And that, in the end, is the most important thing that the 12 things Enki said about Earth tell us. The most important thing is not in any of the first 11 statements. It is in the 12th. And the 12th does not describe an endpoint. It describes a relationship that is still active, a binding that is still operative, a presence that is still here, because the work that was placed here is still growing toward what it was placed to become. And what it was placed to become is whatever we become when we finish finding out who we are. The tablets were waiting for us. We found them. Now read them again. There is one more question that this investigation raises, and it is the question that most viewers who have followed this material to its conclusion will find themselves sitting with in the days after they have finished watching. The question is not whether the ancient astronaut interpretation is correct. You have been given the evidence. You have been given the alternative explanations. You have been given the weight of the assessment. The question of correctness is one that each person who engages seriously with this material has to answer for themselves, because the answer depends on which prior commitments you are willing to release and which ones you are not. The question that remains after correctness has been bracketed is this: if the 12 statements are a report rather than mythology, if Enki was a real entity who made these statements about a real project and they were preserved in the oldest writing on Earth, then what is the appropriate response to that reality? Some researchers in the ancient astronaut tradition respond with urgency. The binding persists. The experiment is at a critical juncture. The decisions made in this phase of human development will determine whether the work reaches its completion or whether another catastrophic reset becomes necessary. The appropriate response is immediate and serious engagement with the evidence, political and social action based on the understanding that human governance and human institutional structures are operating in a context that is larger than those structures currently acknowledge. Other researchers respond with patience. The cycle is long. The work has been developing for longer than any current human institution can fully account for. The appropriate response is individual engagement with the investigation, personal deepening of the looking up that Statement 5 says is built into the design, and trust that the cycle is moving in the direction that Statement 12 describes regardless of the specific choices made in any individual human generation. A third group of researchers responds with the question itself. The appropriate response to uncertainty about a claim this significant is not urgency or patience, but continued investigation. More translations, more archaeological work, more serious engagement with the anomalous phenomena that the mainstream tradition continues to classify without explaining. More comparative mythology, more genetics, more astronomy. The investigation is not finished because the evidence is not complete, and the evidence will not be complete until the looking up reaches the level of precision that allows the question of report versus mythology to be definitively answered. All three responses are reasonable. All three are consistent with what the 12 statements actually say. And all three are expressions of the looking up that Statement 5 says was built into the design. The ancient astronaut tradition does not tell you which response is correct. It gives you the statements and the evidence and the framework and asks you to look up, because the looking up is the design, and the design is still running. 12 statements. One planet, one experiment, one binding that persists until the work reaches what it was placed to become. The work is us. And us is still becoming. The tablets that contain the 12 statements are real. They are in museums. The translations are accessible. You do not have to take this reading on faith. The ancient astronaut interpretation is a reading of real primary sources. It may be wrong, but it is not baseless. And the sources it reads are the oldest written testimony about who we are and where we came from that exists on this earth. Reading them is not fringe behavior. It is the most direct engagement with human origin that is available to any person willing to follow the evidence where it goes. The 12 statements are there, preserved for exactly what Statement 8 says they were preserved for us to read them, and to keep looking up. The work is not finished, neither are we. The binding persists. That has always been true. The 12 statements are not a destination, they are our compass. They orient the looking up that Statement 5 says was built in and cannot ever be prevented.